Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I used to work the night shift at this toll booth. It was a quiet spot, out on this long stretch of road where barely anyone passed by after midnight. It was routine, mostly. Sometimes a truck driver would roll through or someone going to or from a late shift, but otherwise, it was just me and the empty road. I liked it that way. Just the hum of the booth, the radio in the background, and the occasional headlights breaking up the dark. One night, it was around 1 a.m., and I was leaning back in my chair, half dozing. A car rolled up, and the headlights cut through the booth. I sat up, shook myself awake, ready to take the toll and wave the guy on. Only, the car didn't pull up to the window like usual. It stopped a little way back, maybe a few yards behind where it should have been. The engine was running, but no one got out, and no window rolled down. Just the idling sound of the car. I squinted, trying to see through the windshield, but the glare from the headlights made it impossible to see much. All I could make out was the shape of someone sitting there, watching me. I waited a minute, maybe two, figuring they'd just pull forward any second. But they didn't. I coughed, leaned out of the window, and waved, trying to signal them forward. Nothing. They just sat there, still as anything, like they were in a trance or something. I felt uneasy. Most people don't stop in the middle of the night unless they're lost or need directions. I picked up my radio, thinking about calling someone, but I'd been working there long enough to know it'd get me laughed at. Some guy's just sitting there, watching me. I could hear the jokes already. So I just watched him back. Another few minutes passed, and finally, the engine cut out. Headlights went off, and for a second, I was relieved. Figured he was just going to get out and ask for directions or something. But no one got out. The car just sat there in the dark, with this shadow of a person still in the driver's seat. That's when the fear started creeping in. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was staring at me. I could feel it, the kind of thing that pricks at the back of your neck. I leaned back, tried to look busy, flipping through some papers, but my mind wasn't on any of that. Every few seconds, I'd glance up, and he was still there, not moving, just watching. I don't know how long I sat like that. It must have been at least 20 minutes. Long enough for me to start feeling trapped. I thought about stepping out of the booth, maybe walking up to the car, but something about that idea didn't sit right. The way he just pulled up and stayed like that, it didn't feel like he was here for directions. It felt like he was waiting for something. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the radio, ready to call for backup, when his car door opened. I froze, my finger hovering over the button. The man stepped out, but he didn't come toward the booth. Instead, he just stood there, leaning against his car, arms crossed, eyes locked on me. I looked back, meeting his gaze through the glass. He was standing too far to make out his features, just the outline of him in the dark. But I could tell he wasn't some lost traveler. He was different. Something about his stance, the way he was so calm and still, like he had all the time in the world. Minutes passed. I stared, he stared back. I tried to focus on other things, look away, but it was like he was daring me to look, to see if I'd do anything about it. I started feeling sick. My hands were clammy, my breathing shallow, the hairs on my arms standing up. It must have been an hour by then. An hour of him just watching. Not speaking, not moving any closer. I wanted to leave, but my shift wasn't over, and I knew the boss would have my head if I abandoned my post. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? A man standing outside my booth. But he wasn't just standing. There was something wrong about him. Something in his silence. I felt trapped, caged in that little glass box. I kept glancing at the clock, hoping he'd lose interest, get bored, anything. But he just stayed there, like he could go all night. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, he did something that made my blood run cold. He tilted his head, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile. No, it was slow, deliberate, like he'd been planning to smile that whole time, just waiting for the right moment. And that smile said something. It said he was in control. That I couldn't do anything. I forced myself to look away, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. I couldn't look back at him, couldn't let him see the fear. I stared at the clock instead, counting the seconds, praying he'd leave. At some point, I heard footsteps. They were soft, barely audible over the hum of the booth, but they were there, coming closer. I couldn't see him anymore, but I knew he was moving, circling the booth. I tried not to breathe, hoping he'd think I wasn't there. The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him standing there, just inches away, separated by a thin layer of glass and metal. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just waited, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps moving away. I looked up and saw him walking back to his car. He got in, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road. But he didn't leave right away. He drove slowly past the booth, rolling to a stop just a few feet away, and that smile was back, a little wider, a little more certain. I don't know how long I sat there, staring back at him. He waited, like he was savoring it, letting me feel the fear. Then, finally, he drove off into the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in my booth, waiting for my shift to end, my hands still shaking, my eyes fixed on the road, half expecting him to come back. When the morning shift arrived, I left without a word, got in my car, and drove straight home. I quit that job the next day. And ever since, whenever I'm out late, whenever I see headlights behind me or a car that seems to follow just a little too close, I think of that man, his face in the shadows, that slow, awful smile. I'll never know what he wanted, but I'm grateful he didn't get it. It was a quiet job, mostly. Not much traffic that late at night. I worked at a small convenience store on the graveyard shift. It wasn't the best job, but it paid the bills, and honestly, I liked the quiet. It was just me, a few aisles of snacks and drinks, and the hum of the overhead lights. The store had a glass front, so I could see anyone coming up before they got inside, which I guess made me feel a little safer. A few weeks into the job, I started noticing this guy. Tall, maybe late 30s or early 40s, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in ages. I'd see him standing by the entrance around 2 or 3 in the morning, just outside the lights. He never came in, never even stepped close to the door. Just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the store. Watching me. At first, I thought he was just a guy waiting for a ride or maybe someone's boyfriend who didn't want to go inside. But after a few nights, it became clear he wasn't waiting for anyone. He was there for no reason, or at least, no reason that made sense to me. Just standing there, like he was making sure I knew he was there. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on my work. There's always something to do in a place like that, even at night, stocking shelves, cleaning up, things to keep busy. But every time I'd look up, he'd still be out there, staring at me. Then one night, he didn't leave after a few minutes like he usually did. He stayed longer, and then even longer, until an hour had passed, and he was still there. Just standing, his face half in shadow, staring through the glass. I felt my skin crawl, and I kept checking the clock, hoping my shift would end soon. Finally, I mustered up enough courage to pick up the phone and pretend to dial, holding it to my ear like I was calling someone. Maybe I thought he'd get the hint and leave. But he didn't move. He just kept standing there, his eyes fixed on me like he knew I wasn't really talking to anyone. The next night, he was back. This time, he was closer to the door, still outside, but right at the edge of the glass where the light from the store hit his face. I could see him better now, see the dullness in his eyes, the slight twitch in his jaw as he watched me. It made me feel sick, like I was some kind of animal in a cage, and he was just waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked up to the door, keeping it locked, and shouted through the glass, "Do you need something?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the shake in it. He didn't respond, just kept staring. I backed away, feeling a cold sweat break out over my skin. That night, I asked my boss if we could install security cameras outside, or maybe at least have someone else cover the late shift with me. She laughed it off, said he was probably harmless. But it didn't feel harmless. It felt like he was testing me somehow, pushing me to see how far he could go. A few nights later, he was back again. But this time, he didn't just stand outside. He came in. I was restocking the shelves, keeping myself busy like usual, and when I turned around, there he was, just a few feet away. I hadn't even heard the door chime. He was just there, standing at the end of the aisle, staring at me. I forced myself to look at him, trying to act like I wasn't afraid, but my hands were shaking so bad I had to hold them behind my back. "Can I help you?" I managed to say, though my throat felt tight. He didn't answer, just kept looking at me. Then, without breaking eye contact, he moved further into the aisle, closer to where I was standing. My mind was racing, telling me to run, to get out of there, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. "Do you need something?" I asked again, a little louder this time. Still, no response. Then he smiled, this slow, horrible smile that made my stomach twist. He walked over to the shelves, pretending to look at the items, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching me from the side. I backed up a few steps, trying to put some distance between us, but he followed, moving along the aisle with me. And then, he said my name. "Emma." Just like that. Calm, like we were old friends or something. I felt my heart drop. I hadn't told him my name. My name tag was hidden under my jacket, and there was no way he could have seen it. How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer. Just stared at me with that smile, like he knew a secret I didn't. I felt a wave of nausea, realizing this guy knew more about me than I'd ever wanted him to. How long had he been watching me? How much did he know? I took a shaky step back, then another, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. He watched me retreat, his eyes never leaving mine, that sick smile still on his face. I fumbled for my phone, pulling it out and threatening to call the police. "I'll call them right now," I stammered, my thumb hovering over the screen. But he just laughed, this low, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. "No one's coming," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "No one's coming, Emma." He took a step toward me, and I bolted. I didn't care if my boss would be mad about me leaving the store unattended. I ran out the back, not looking back, sprinting into the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. I called the police from there, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. They came and searched the store, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They said they'd keep an eye out for him, but I knew they wouldn't find him. And even if they did, he'd be back. I quit the job the next day. It didn't matter how much I needed the money. I couldn't go back there, couldn't stand the thought of being alone in that place with him lurking outside. Sometimes, late at night, I think I see him. A man standing across the street in the shadows, watching. I don't know if it's really him, or if my mind is playing tricks on me. All I know is, I'll never feel safe in a place like that again. I was working the night shift at this factory out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a busy place, especially at night, with just a skeleton crew to keep things running. You'd have a few guys scattered around, doing their jobs alone. Mostly, people kept to themselves. I liked it that way, clock in, do my work, clock out. Just another night job, really. But lately, something had started to feel off. There was this guy, Mark. He was new, maybe had been there a few weeks. We didn't talk much, just the usual nod of acknowledgement if we passed each other on the floor. But he had this habit of staring a little too long. I'd feel his eyes on me as I worked, like he was trying to catch me doing something. I'd look up, and there he'd be, just standing there, staring. He'd look away real quick when he realized I saw him, but it was enough to get under my skin. At first, I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just awkward. Maybe the night shift was getting to him. It happens. People get weird when they're up all night working in a quiet, empty place. But then he started doing things that made me second guess that. One night, I was in the break room, having my coffee. It was dead quiet except for the hum of the machines outside. Out of nowhere, I got this strange feeling, like I was being watched. I looked up and nearly jumped out of my skin. There he was, Mark, standing just outside the doorway, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. He was staring at me, dead-eyed, like he didn't even realize he'd been caught. I didn't say anything, just kept my eyes on him, waiting for him to do something, say something, anything. But he just turned and walked away, real casual, like he hadn't just been creeping in the doorway. I went back to my coffee, but I couldn't shake that feeling. Why had he been standing there like that? And why hadn't he said anything? Over the next few days, it got worse. I'd be working on a machine, and I'd catch a glimpse of him, half hidden behind equipment, just watching. I'd look away, try to focus on my work, but every time I turned my head, there he'd be. Not close, not doing anything, just watching. One night, I decided to confront him. I couldn't stand it anymore. We were in the same area, and I spotted him again, lurking behind a conveyor belt. I marched over to him, my nerves shot, and asked him straight up, "Why do you keep staring at me, man? What's your problem?" He looked at me with this blank expression, like he didn't even understand what I was talking about. He shrugged, mumbled something about being lost in thought, then walked off without another word. It didn't feel like an answer. He just kept doing it. It was always the same. I'd turn around, and there he'd be, half hidden behind something, his eyes fixed on me like he was waiting for something, but I never knew what. Sometimes he'd disappear, then show up in another part of the factory, watching me from a distance. He was always just far enough away that I couldn't hear him, couldn't read his expression clearly, but I could see his eyes always on me. One night, things went further. I was working late on a machine that needed repairs, and I thought I was alone. The factory was dark except for the work lights above me, casting long shadows over everything. I'd been crouched down for a while, focused on getting a part installed. When I stood up, he was there, right behind me, so close I almost walked into him. I had no idea how long he'd been standing there, and he didn't back up when I noticed him. He just stood there, staring. "What the hell, Mark?" I snapped, stepping back, heart pounding in my chest. "Do you need something?" He didn't answer. Just kept staring, his face blank, eyes locked on mine. Then, real slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, not even close. It was thin, almost forced, like he was trying to look friendly but couldn't quite get it right. I backed away, feeling a cold sweat break out over my skin. I didn't know what he was playing at, but something in that smile sent a chill down my spine. I mumbled something about getting back to work and walked off, hoping he wouldn't follow. But he did. Every time I looked over my shoulder, he was there, just far enough to keep his distance, but always within sight. I felt trapped, like a rat in a cage with nowhere to go. I kept moving, trying to shake him, but he stayed close, lurking in the shadows, always watching. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the supervisor's office and told him what was going on. He didn't take it seriously, just laughed it off, said Mark was probably just bored. But it didn't feel like boredom. It felt like he was watching me for a reason, like he knew something I didn't. That night, I stayed in the break room as long as I could, hoping he'd get bored and leave. But every time I glanced out, I'd see him standing just outside the door, half hidden in the shadows. Waiting. Watching. It felt like he was trying to wear me down, like he wanted me to snap. I didn't know what he was after, but I knew it wasn't anything good. The worst part came a few nights later. I was working on another machine, and for the first time, I thought I had some peace. I hadn't seen him all night, and I was finally starting to relax. But then I felt it, that same heavy feeling of being watched. I turned around, expecting to see him off in the distance, but he wasn't there. Then I looked up. He was on the catwalk above me, leaning over the railing, staring down with that same creepy smile. He didn't say anything, didn't move. Just stood there, watching. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal. I wanted to run, but I couldn't look away. His eyes were fixed on mine, dark and unblinking, like he was daring me to make a move. I don't remember how long we stood like that, me frozen in place, him staring down from above. Finally, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, and I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what his deal was, but after that, I knew I couldn't stay. I put in my notice the next day, didn't even finish out the week. I don't know what he wanted, don't know why he kept watching me like that, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is, every time I close my eyes, I see him standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, with that awful smile. I was working the night shift at the hospital, doing my rounds on a wing that was still under construction. It wasn't officially open yet, just bare walls, empty rooms, and scattered equipment waiting to be moved into place. They had me patrol there since no one else wanted to go in. Most people said it was too creepy. But to me, it was just another part of the job. I'd been working there a couple of months, used to the odd sounds and dark hallways. But this night felt different. There was this strange energy in the air, like a thickness that sat on my shoulders. It was dead quiet, too quiet for comfort, and the usual hum from the construction lights seemed muted. I started my rounds, checking the empty rooms, peeking into the shadows, making sure there was nothing there. I wasn't expecting much, maybe the usual bit of equipment left out or a tool bag left on a floor. But as I got to the end of one of the long hallways, I heard it. A whisper, low and drawn out, coming from one of the rooms off to the left. I froze, heart pounding, listening to the quiet. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely someone whispering. It wasn't just some weird echo from my footsteps, and it wasn't coming from the HVAC. This was human, close, like someone was hiding right behind the wall, just out of sight. I steadied myself, reached for my flashlight, and slowly moved toward the sound. I didn't turn on the light yet. I wanted to listen first, just in case I'd imagined it. But as I stepped into the doorway of that empty room, I saw a figure in the shadows. It was a man, sitting in the far corner, hunched over. He looked rough, like he'd been on the streets for a long time. Greasy hair, dirt street clothes, shoes that looked more like scraps than anything else. He wasn't moving, just sitting there, watching me. I called out, tried to keep my voice steady, asked him what he was doing here, told him he couldn't stay in the hospital. I expected him to maybe get defensive, maybe even get up and leave. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring. Then he said something, real soft, almost like he was talking to himself. "I've been here," he whispered, his eyes locked on me. "Been here waiting for a reason." That sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to tell him to leave, tell him that security was on the way, but something about him kept me from saying a word. He seemed familiar, like I'd seen him before, but I couldn't place where or when. You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his voice scratchy and rough. I shook my head, a sick feeling settling in my stomach. I told him again that he had to leave, but he just stayed there, smiling this sad, knowing smile. It didn't look threatening, but something about it made me want to be anywhere else but here. "I saw you last week," he said, almost in a whisper. "On your other shift, across the street by the loading docks." He paused, his eyes narrowing, watching for my reaction. "And 2 nights before that, in the parking garage. You walk slow when you're alone, did you know that?" My skin crawled. The thought of him watching me made me feel trapped, exposed. I tried to stay calm, tell him he was trespassing, that I'd have to call someone if he didn't leave. But he just leaned his head back against the wall, his gaze never leaving mine. "People like you never notice people like me," he muttered, almost to himself. "You walk around, always looking right past, never thinking who's behind the next corner." He was right. I hadn't noticed him before. I'd never once thought about a homeless man following me around or hiding in the hospital. But hearing him say it out loud, like it was some game he'd been playing, turned my blood cold. I tried to stay firm, tried to keep my voice steady as I told him to get up, to get out. But he didn't. He just kept talking, almost like he was in a trance. "You know, I always knew you'd end up here," he said, like it was some kind of twisted fate. "It's like it was meant to be." I stepped back, fumbling for my radio, but my hands were shaking too much to grip it. He watched me, eyes narrowing with a strange kind of interest, as if he could feel my fear. Then he stood up, slow and unsteady, and I took another step back, holding my flashlight up as a weak defense. "You don't have to be scared," he whispered, moving closer. "I'm not gonna hurt you, not here." That didn't make me feel any better. I finally managed to get my radio to work, call for backup, but the guy just smiled, this eerie, calm smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think they'll get here in time?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. I turned to get out of the room, but he stepped in front of the door, blocking my way. I could see now just how tall he was, how his clothes hung loose on his thin frame, his eyes hollow and dark. He reached out, like he was going to touch my arm, and I jerked back, slamming into the wall. Then, without another word, he took a step back, turned, and walked out into the hallway. I watched as he disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps quiet, almost like he'd never been there at all. I stayed in that room, frozen, until my backup arrived. They searched the whole wing, but they didn't find him. After that, I quit the job. I couldn't stay there, not knowing he might be lurking somewhere nearby, waiting for me, watching. It was a job, that was all. Working nights at a small airport in the middle of nowhere wasn't anyone's dream, but it was steady work, and I liked the quiet. My main duties were to keep an eye on things, handle the few flights that came through, and make sure no one was where they shouldn't be. I mostly dealt with people who missed flights or wandered where they shouldn't. Not exactly thrilling, but it paid. The odd stuff started one night when I found a suitcase in an out-of-the-way spot. It was a red, beat-up roller bag tucked back near the emergency exit on the ground floor. At first, I thought someone had just forgotten it. I went over to check the tag, see if there was a name, but it didn't have one. Just a plain, worn-out suitcase with no ID. Maybe someone would come back for it, I figured, so I left it alone. But the next night, it was still there. That was against protocol, so I figured I'd better open it and see if there was any ID or contact info inside. I took it back to the lost and found office and opened it up. Inside, there was only a single item, a worn-out teddy bear. It looked ancient, all frayed edges and missing fur, one button I barely hanging on. It was strange to find that, and only that, in a suitcase. But people travel with weird stuff sometimes, so I didn't think much of it. I logged it in, put it in storage, and went back to my rounds. The next night, another suitcase showed up in the exact same spot, leaning against the emergency exit. This one was green, slightly smaller, with scratches all over it. No ID on this one either, and nothing to show who might have left it. I opened it, figuring maybe it would be some other random item, maybe some clothes or a phone charger. But inside, all there was a single shoe. A single, muddy sneaker. Small, maybe a kid's size, stained and scuffed like it had been through hell. It felt wrong, like I shouldn't be holding it, but I put it with the teddy bear in Lost and Found, trying not to overthink it. I knew what you could find in abandoned luggage sometimes, but this felt different. Too deliberate. By the third night, I was actually nervous coming in, which was ridiculous. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I started my shift and tried not to think about it, but sure enough, there it was. Another suitcase, same spot, waiting for me. This one was an old leather one with cracked sides, and the zipper looked like it had been forced open a few times. I took it back to the office, hesitated, then unzipped it. Inside was a photo, a black and white photo, curled up at the edges, of a little girl staring blankly into the camera. She was standing alone in what looked like a backyard, her face expressionless, almost empty. She looked straight at me, even through the faded paper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. I quickly shoved the photo back in and closed the bag, deciding I had enough of weird, creepy surprises for the night. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was messing with me. I checked the security cameras, but there was no footage of anyone dropping these bags off. It was as if they just appeared. I started wondering if it was some twisted prank, but no one ever seemed to be around at night. It was just me, in that empty airport. The next night, I tried to catch whoever it was in the act. I did my rounds, keeping an eye on the emergency exit area from a distance, hoping I could spot someone slipping in. But it was dead quiet. Around 2 in the morning, though, I noticed a figure, standing outside near the drop-off curb, under one of the dim lights. He was dressed in a dark jacket, his face shadowed under a hood. He had a suitcase with him, and I felt a chill creep over me as he picked it up and started walking toward the building. He stopped, right at the glass doors, looking in as if checking for something. I ducked down, out of sight, heart pounding. He waited there for a few moments, then set the suitcase down and walked off, disappearing into the night. I wanted to follow him, but something in me told me not to. I waited until I was sure he was gone, then slowly went over to the suitcase, my hands trembling a bit. It was another old bag, dusty and worn, and I didn't want to know what was inside. But I couldn't just leave it there. I took it back to the office, half hoping it'd be empty, but of course, it wasn't. Inside was a small, rusted key and a folded-up note. My fingers felt numb as I reached for the note, unfolding it slowly. Scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting were the words, "It's your turn now. We've been watching you." I felt my blood run cold. I looked around, as if somehow they'd be there, watching me right then. But there was nothing, just the silent hum of the airport lights and the faint echo of my own breathing. I shoved the note back in, locked the suitcase, and threw it in the lost and found, my hands shaking. I couldn't leave it at that, though. I went back to check the cameras, hoping for any sign of that man who'd dropped the bag off. But there was nothing. The cameras had somehow missed him, or maybe he'd known exactly where to stand, just out of frame. It was like he'd never been there at all. The rest of the night, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing over my shoulder, jumping at every little noise. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, following me through the empty halls. I even thought I heard footsteps a few times, but every time I turned around, there was no one there. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, nerves shot. I headed out to my car, parked in the nearly empty lot. As I unlocked my door, I noticed something on the ground just a few feet away. Another suitcase. This one was small, a battered black bag with a broken handle. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was inside. But I felt like I had to, like if I didn't, it would follow me somehow. I crouched down, hesitated, then unzipped it. Inside was a mirror, a small, cracked mirror, dusty and worn. I picked it up, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw my reflection. But it wasn't right. There was something off. It was my face, but my eyes looked empty, hollow, like someone else was staring back at me. I dropped the mirror, backed away, and slammed the car door shut, not daring to look back at the suitcase. I drove home, barely able to focus, every shadow in the road looking like someone waiting, watching. That was my last shift. I never went back. I couldn't. I told myself it was just a prank, some sick joke, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whoever it was, whatever they wanted, they'd been watching me. And somehow, I felt like they still were. I used to work night shifts at a small hotel just off the highway. The place was never busy, especially on weekdays. It was an older building, a bit run down, and mostly just truck drivers and folks passing through stayed there. My job was simple: check guests in, answer the phone, and sit at the desk until my shift was up. It was quiet most nights, nothing unusual ever happened. This night started out the same as any other. I had one guest check in around 10, an older man on his way to some job upstate. After he settled into his room, the place was empty. I leaned back, watching the clock and scrolling through my phone to pass the time. Around midnight, the phone rang. I picked it up. "Front desk, how can I help you?" The voice on the other end was a man, deep and calm, but with this edge to it. He asked if I could bring some extra towels to his room. Standard request, nothing weird. I told him no problem and asked for his room number. "Room 306, he said. But we only had 2 floors. I thought maybe he'd made a mistake, so I asked again. He just repeated, 306. There was a pause, like he was waiting for something. I told him I'd check on it, then hung up, feeling a little thrown off. I checked the registry. There was no one in any room even close to 306. We didn't have a third floor. I picked up the phone again and dialed back the number, but there was only static on the other end, like the line was dead. I hung up, brushed it off as a prank, and went back to my phone. About an hour later, the phone rang again. This time, the man's voice sounded a bit different, lower and slower, like he was dragging out each word. He said he'd been waiting for his towels. I told him I couldn't find his room on the registry and asked him if he was sure he was in the right hotel. "You're standing at the front desk right now, aren't you?" he asked. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I hadn't told him that, but sure, it wasn't hard to guess. I just said, "Yeah, I am," trying to keep my voice steady. "Then you can see me, right?" he said, like it was obvious. I didn't understand. I looked around, even glanced at the security monitors, but all I saw was the empty lobby and the hallways, empty as usual. "Come on," he whispered. "You're looking right at me." I could feel my hands start to sweat. I told him I didn't see anyone and asked him, again, if he was sure he had the right place. "Look at the cameras again," he said, like he was standing right behind me. I looked back at the monitor, and my heart stopped. In the camera showing the hallway outside my desk, there was this blur. Just a shadowy blur that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a person, not clearly, but it was something, like a dark shape just hovering in the middle of the hallway. I told myself it was probably a glitch, a trick of the light or a bug in the system. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned back to the phone to tell him I didn't see anything, but he'd already hung up. I put the phone down, trying to calm my breathing. Just as I was starting to feel normal again, the phone rang once more. I almost didn't want to answer, but it was my job. When I picked up, he didn't say anything right away. I could just hear breathing, steady and slow. And then he said, "You left the front desk." I hadn't. I was still sitting right there, the phone pressed against my ear. I hadn't moved an inch. "You left it," he repeated. "Come closer." My heart was pounding. I didn't understand how he could know what I was doing in real time. I told him I wasn't going anywhere and asked who he was. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he just started describing the front desk area in detail, the old fake potted plant we had, the peeling wallpaper, the little bell we kept there. Then he said, "That door behind you, it's cracked open, isn't it?" I turned, just to check, and sure enough, the maintenance door behind the desk, which I'd locked at the start of my shift, was open. Just barely, a sliver of darkness showing through. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't seen anyone come in. My stomach dropped. I told him, firmly, that I didn't know what he wanted, and that he needed to leave or I was going to call the cops. There was a pause, and then he laughed, this low, dry laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. "The cops can't help you," he said softly. I hung up and stared at the monitors, scanning every hallway and corner. But everything looked still, empty, the same as always. I started to wonder if maybe I was losing it, hearing things, imagining the whole thing. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just someone messing with me. But then, right when I was beginning to relax, I saw it. On the monitor for the front entrance, a man walked into the lobby, just inside the door, and stopped. He was standing in a spot the camera barely caught, like he knew exactly where to stand to stay in the shadows. I couldn't see his face, just his outline, but he stood there, staring in the direction of the front desk. I picked up the phone to call the cops, but the line was dead. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. I was stuck. And that's when I heard a noise behind me, the soft sound of something tapping, a slow, steady tap coming from the maintenance door. I looked back at the monitor, and the man was gone. I turned toward the maintenance door, trying to see if someone was there, but I didn't dare go closer. I stood up, ready to grab my things and leave, but then the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer, but my hands moved on their own. I lifted the receiver to my ear, and there was silence. No breathing, no voice. I almost hung up, but then I heard it faintly, just above a whisper. "Are you scared yet?" I slammed the phone down, grabbed my bag, and ran out of there, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't look back at the building. I drove straight home, heart racing the entire way. I didn't even bother telling my manager what had happened the next day. I just called in and quit on the spot. That was the last night I ever worked there. I still don't know who he was, or how he was watching me, but sometimes, even now, I still feel like someone's keeping an eye on me, just out of sight. I was working the late shift, middle of nowhere. This stretch of road was always empty at night, especially around the hills where the nearest town was almost 20 miles off. No one had any reason to be out there unless they were up to something, so whenever I saw a car parked on the shoulder, I had to check it out. It was just after 2 a.m. when I spotted the car, parked off to the side with no lights on. That got my attention right away. People usually left their hazards on if they broke down, at least to be safe. But this car was dead silent, headlights and taillights completely off. It was just this dark shape, barely visible in the moonlight. I pulled up behind it, keeping my headlights on. I couldn't see anyone in the driver's seat from where I was sitting, but I figured they'd be slumped down or maybe asleep. Happens more than you'd think. So I got out, flashlight in hand, and approached the car, staying a bit on edge. I tapped the back window first, then the driver's side window, just to be safe. But there was no movement inside, no answer. When I shined my flashlight through the glass, I didn't see anyone. The car was empty. Not even a sign of a driver or passenger. Now, that was strange enough. I mean, who leaves a car on a deserted highway in the middle of the night without even leaving the hazards on? But then I noticed something else. There was a piece of paper pinned to the seat in the back. Looked like a note, actually a stack of them, all torn out sheets held together with a clip, like something someone had put together just for me to find. I reached for the door handle. Locked. I went back to my cruiser, grabbed my Slim Jim, and got the door open after a few tries. As soon as I popped the door, there was this stale, musty smell that hit me, like the car had been sealed up for years. It didn't make sense, but I didn't dwell on it. I reached in and took the stack of papers. The top one was facing up, and my stomach dropped when I saw my name on it. In big, messy letters, all caps, written across the top, Officer Kelly. Now, I hadn't told anyone I'd be patrolling this road. Only my station knew I was working this stretch. Nobody else. So right away, I started getting this sick feeling in my gut. I took a closer look at the note. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike. The first few lines didn't make much sense, something about finding what's yours and not leaving it behind. It wasn't clear. Just a rambling mess, like whoever wrote it was either angry or losing it. Flipping through the pages, it only got worse. The next sheet had a list of places I'd been. Old case scenes I'd been to, intersections I'd patrolled. My high school, my favorite diner back in town. My actual address. Every location was listed out in detail, each one with the date and time I'd been there, like someone had been watching me for a long time, following me around. They knew everything. The third page was the worst. It had my wife's name. My kids' names. My wife's work schedule. Every single one of their details, down to my daughter's bus route, the park where my son had baseball practice every Thursday night. All of it was there, scribbled down in the same shaky writing. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck, and I forced myself to keep flipping through the stack. Each page had something new, something worse. Places I went on my days off. A list of my regular coffee orders. Things I've done months ago, things I didn't even think anyone noticed. And at the bottom of each page, in that same shaky writing, they'd written a message, "I know you, Officer Kelly." I kept looking around the highway, half expecting to see someone standing out there, just watching. But it was only me in the dark. Dead quiet except for the hum of my cruiser's engine. I went back to the car, scanned the area with my flashlight, thinking maybe someone had gone into the brush or was hiding somewhere nearby. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind and the rustle of dry grass. Then I heard it, a faint click. I looked back at the abandoned car, and my stomach turned when I saw the dome light flicker on. It had been off when I opened the door, completely dead. Now, it was on, glowing faintly, like someone had just opened the door from the inside. But the car was empty. I checked it myself. I backed up toward my cruiser, one hand on my gun, the other on my flashlight, never taking my eyes off that car. I knew I should call it in, but something stopped me. Part of me didn't want anyone else involved. This felt personal, like whoever had left these notes had planned this just for me. Bringing in backup felt wrong, like it would only make things worse somehow. The light flickered off again. I kept my distance, but I could feel something was off, like a weight in the air, pressing down on me. Then I noticed a new note, one I hadn't seen before, tucked just under the driver's seat. I reached for it, hands shaking, and pulled it out. It said, "Don't go home tonight." That was it. Just those 4 words, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just someone messing with me, they knew where I lived, where my family was. They were watching me, even now. I don't remember the drive back to the station. I just know that I locked up the car and handed the keys to the guy on the next shift, mumbling something about needing the night off. I left, drove around aimlessly, too on edge to go home. I parked in a lot on the other side of town and just sat there, heart racing, watching the shadows around my car. Eventually, when the sun started coming up, I went back to the station. I filed a report, told my supervisor everything, and asked for the night off to clear my head. But I never found out who it was or why they did it. They'd left no prints, no clues, just those pages filled with my life, like it was all just some game to them. I was on the night shift, alone at this gas station out by the highway. Quiet place. Middle of nowhere, nothing much except the long road stretching out and a couple of dim lights over the parking lot. Most nights, I'd barely see a car for hours. Just me, the flickering overhead lights, and the low hum of the refrigerators in the back. It was one of those nights, dead quiet. I'd finished stocking shelves, and it was only 1 a.m., so I still had a long shift ahead. I was wiping down the counters, making sure the coffee machine was clean, doing little things to pass the time. When I went to wipe down the windows, I noticed there was something scrawled across one of them. Just a smudge at first glance, but I leaned in closer, and it was clear as day. Someone had written, "Hello." I was a little freaked, to be honest. I hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't seen a car pull up. It was quiet outside, and the air felt heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. I brushed it off, wiped the word away, and went back behind the counter. I tried to convince myself it was some prank. I figured maybe some kid had done it before I'd come in and I just hadn't noticed. But then, maybe half an hour later, I turned around to grab a drink from the fridge, and when I looked back at the windows, there was another message. This time, it was longer, scrawled right across the glass in big, messy letters. "Why did you erase me?" I felt this chill crawl up my spine. My hands were shaking as I walked up to the window, looking out into the empty parking lot. Nothing but shadows and the dim outline of trees in the distance. I squinted, trying to see if anyone was out there, but I couldn't make anything out. I grabbed a rag and wiped the message off, feeling like I was being watched. I checked the security camera feed to see if anyone had come near the window, but there was nothing. Just me in the store, no sign of anyone outside. I started getting paranoid, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, feeling like someone was standing just out of sight. I went about my tasks, trying to ignore the feeling. But every time I turned my back for a few minutes, there'd be another message waiting for me. Each time, it felt like it got more personal. "I can see you. Don't look away." It was getting under my skin. I checked the cameras again, rewinding to see if I'd missed something. Finally, I noticed something strange in the footage. There was a gap, just a few seconds of static where the camera had gone dark. Right after that, the message would appear on the glass. Like someone was sneaking up to the window while the camera was out, writing their messages, and then disappearing before the feed returned. I started watching the windows like a hawk, but I couldn't catch anyone in the act. Every time I glanced away, just for a second, another message would appear. I started getting angry, trying to call out, telling whoever was out there to knock it off, but my voice just echoed back at me. Then came the message that made my blood run cold. In messy, smudged letters, it said, "Check the camera. You'll see me." I went straight back to the monitor, heart pounding. I rewound the feed, and at first, it looked like nothing was there. Just the empty parking lot, the store, and me standing alone inside. But as I kept watching, I caught a flash of movement near the bottom of the screen. I zoomed in, squinting, and saw something that made my stomach twist. There was a figure crawling along the ground, just low enough to avoid the camera's main view. I couldn't see much, just the shape of a person on their hands and knees, scuttling close to the wall, sneaking right up to the window. They'd reach up with a hand, swipe their fingers across the glass to leave a message, then drop back down and crawl away. I was shaking as I watched. Whoever they were, they'd been crawling just out of sight all night, coming up to the windows whenever I turned my back. It was the worst feeling I'd ever had, knowing they were that close, creeping up without making a sound, just watching and waiting for me to look away. I wanted to call someone, but there was no one around. I'd be lucky if anyone even passed by this gas station before dawn. So I decided to confront them. I grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter, stepped outside, and called out. My voice sounded small, barely carrying in the heavy air. "Whoever's out here, just show yourself." I yelled. My voice echoed out, swallowed by the trees. No answer. I scanned the area with the flashlight, swinging the beam across the parking lot, up along the side of the building. Nothing. I stepped around the back of the store, looking between the trees, my heart racing. Just when I was about to give up, I heard something. It was a faint rustling sound, like fabric against the ground, coming from somewhere nearby. I swung my flashlight around, catching a glimpse of movement behind the dumpster. My hands were sweaty, but I forced myself to step closer. When I finally rounded the corner, I saw them. A man, crouched low, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight. He was grinning at me, this wide, unsettling grin that didn't look right. His eyes were wild, locked onto mine, and he didn't say a word. I shouted at him, telling him to leave, to get away from the property. But he just stayed crouched there, grinning. His hands were filthy, dirt caked under his nails, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Finally, he moved. Slowly, he reached up and traced something in the dirt on the ground between us, his eyes never leaving mine. I stepped back, my skin crawling, and without a word, he stood up and disappeared into the dark. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me, trying to shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. I didn't dare look at the windows again, didn't want to see if he'd left another message. I just sat behind the counter, waiting for my shift to end, my heart pounding with every creak and rustle outside. By the time my replacement arrived, I was out of there before he could ask any questions. I didn't even look back as I got in my car and drove off, leaving the gas station and it's empty, staring windows far behind. I'd been working as the night DJ at this small radio station for a few years, the kind of place barely anyone knows about unless they're up late, driving alone, or trying to drown out silence. My shift started around midnight and went until dawn, and most nights, I could count on maybe 2 or 3 people actually calling in. It was mostly just me, the equipment, and the quiet hum of the studio lights. It was about a month ago when I first got the call. The voice on the other end was low and calm, and he didn't start with a name or a song request or even the usual hello. Instead, he said, "You look tired tonight." I paused, a little thrown off. I didn't remember saying anything about being tired on air, but I had been yawning a lot, feeling the weight of the long night ahead. Maybe he just picked up on that from my voice, so I shrugged it off and responded, "Yeah, it's a long shift." "Who's calling in?" The line went silent for a second, then he replied, "I'm just a fan. I'll let you get back to it." And he hung up. I sat there for a moment, unsettled, but tried to brush it off. I figured maybe he was just a regular listener, someone who'd picked up on my tired tone. It wasn't like I was in the best shape those days. Working nights can do that to you. But as the night wore on, the memory of that call kept creeping back, and I couldn't shake this strange feeling, like maybe I'd missed something. The next night, he called again, right around the same time. It was the same calm voice, and this time, he started with, "You should really cut back on those energy drinks." I froze. I'd cracked open my third can about half an hour earlier, the empty one sitting in a line on my desk. I hadn't mentioned it on air, and no one else was in the building. It was just me in the booth, and the idea that someone was watching me made my skin crawl. But I tried to play it cool. "Who is this?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He laughed softly, like he was amused, and said, "Just someone who knows you. I'll be listening." And then he was gone, just like that. The rest of the night, I couldn't shake the creeping feeling, like there were eyes on me from some hidden corner. I checked the building's doors, even looked out the window into the empty parking lot, but there was nothing out there but my own nerves and shadows cast by the streetlights. For the next week, the calls kept coming, always around the same time, always the same voice. Every night, he'd point out something he shouldn't know, little things, like the book I'd been reading on break or what color shirt I had on. One night, he mentioned that I'd left the lights on in the bathroom. I was getting rattled, my nerves fraying, but every time I asked who he was or how he knew these things, he'd just laugh, say something cryptic, and hang up. I talked to my boss about it, told him the calls were getting weird, but he just brushed it off, said it was probably some prank. "It's radio, man," he'd said. "You get all kinds of folks out there. Don't let it get to you." But it was hard not to let it get to me. I started feeling like I couldn't go 5 minutes without looking over my shoulder or glancing out the windows. Every time I heard the phone ring, my stomach twisted, expecting that voice. Then one night, he took it further. I just put a song on and was stretching, trying to keep myself awake, when the phone rang. I picked it up, and before I could say anything, he said, "Your mother was beautiful." I nearly dropped the phone. My mother had passed away years ago, and I'd never mentioned her on air, not once. I don't even know why he said it, but it was like he knew exactly what to say to unnerve me. My voice was shaking as I asked, "How do you know that?" There was a pause, then he whispered, "I told you, I know things." I hung up, my heart racing, my hands clammy. I felt sick. I kept thinking about all the things he'd said, how he seemed to know things no one should know. That night, I barely slept, and when I did, I kept hearing his voice, the way he'd said beautiful like he was savoring the word. Over the next few nights, I started noticing little things around the studio. I'd leave my notebook on one side of the desk and come back to find it on the other. A drawer I hadn't touched would be slightly open, or the pen I'd left on the counter would be gone, only to turn up hours later in a different spot. I told myself I was imagining it, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that someone else had been in the room. Then came the night it all came to a head. It was a quiet shift. I hadn't gotten any calls, and I was starting to think maybe he'd finally given up, moved on to bother someone else. But just as I was beginning to relax, the phone rang. I picked it up, but I didn't say anything. I just listened, waiting for him to make the first move. There was a long silence on the other end, then a low chuckle. "Are you alone tonight?" he asked. My throat was tight, my voice barely more than a whisper as I said, "Where are you?" "Closer than you think," he replied, and then the line went dead. I stood there, frozen, every hair on my body standing on end. I set the phone down, trying to pull myself together, when I noticed something in the reflection of the studio window. It was faint, just a shadow, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. There was someone standing in the doorway behind me. I whipped around, but the door was empty, the hallway beyond stretching into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the desk and shined it down the hall, my hand shaking. There was no one there, just the silence of the empty building. I went back to my desk, heart hammering, and decided to check the security cameras. I pulled up the feed, going back over the past hour, watching every corner of the building. It all looked normal, just the empty halls and the glow of my studio lights. But then, on one of the older recordings, I saw something that made my skin crawl. For just a few seconds, there was a figure standing outside my studio door, staring in through the small window. I couldn't make out his face, but he was tall, with a dark jacket, his face turned toward the camera as if he knew I'd be watching this later. And then, just as quickly, he was gone. I felt like I was losing my mind. I grabbed my things, ready to leave, but then I remembered the call, his voice, that calm certainty. "Closer than you think." It echoed in my head, making my hands shake as I turned off the equipment. Just as I was about to leave, the phone rang one last time. I didn't want to answer, but something made me pick it up. "Leaving already?" he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely steady. There was a pause, and then he said, "You'll find out soon." I hung up, ran out of that building, and never looked back. I quit the job the next day, didn't even bother going back to get my last paycheck. Whatever that was, whoever he was, he knew too much. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been in that building with me, watching me from the shadows, waiting. I just knew that if I ever went back, he'd be there. I had been working the night shift at a 24-hour laundromat for about 6 months. It was a simple job, really, just me and the machines humming softly in the dark. I liked the quiet hours, the rhythm of the washers and dryers, and the way the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. Most nights were uneventful, with just the occasional customer popping in. But there was one man who changed everything. He first walked in one Tuesday night, just as I was finishing up my shift. He was tall, dressed in a long coat, and had this odd way of moving, like he was gliding more than walking. He went straight to the back, where the industrial washers were, and sat down in one of the plastic chairs. At first, I thought he was waiting for a load of laundry. But he didn't bring in any clothes. Instead, he just sat there, staring at me. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the tasks I had to finish. I wiped down the counters, cleaned the lint traps, and kept glancing in his direction. He was still there, his eyes fixed on me, and it felt uncomfortable, like I was under a microscope. I could not shake off the feeling that he was watching my every move. When I finished my work and went to close up for the night, he was still there, just sitting quietly. The next night, he returned. Again, no laundry, just him sitting in the same spot, watching me. It was strange how he came back night after night without ever doing anything. I thought about calling the police, but he hadn't done anything wrong. Just sitting there, it felt like a violation, but I had no right to confront him. As the days passed, I noticed he had a routine. He always arrived around the same time, usually just after midnight, and left before I finished closing. It became a pattern, and I started to dread the moment the door would chime as he entered. He didn't speak, and I didn't ask. I just kept working, trying to convince myself he was harmless. But his presence made the air feel heavy, like I was trapped in some twisted version of my life. One night, I decided I could not take it anymore. I was scrubbing down the machines when I felt his eyes on me again, heavy and insistent. I put down my cloth and walked over to him. The fluorescent lights flickered as I approached, casting a sickly glow on his face. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound calm. "You can't just sit here without doing laundry. I need to ask you to leave." He looked up at me, his expression blank. Then he smiled, and that smile sent a chill through my spine. "I know where you live," he said simply, his voice smooth and quiet. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your address," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "I know it very well." Panic surged through me. "How do you know that?" I demanded, my heart racing. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. He didn't answer right away. He just continued to look at me, that same unnerving smile never leaving his face. I could hear the hum of the machines behind me, louder now, drowning out my thoughts. I wanted to scream for help, but there was no one around. "You live in that little house on Maple Street," he said, his tone casual. "The one with the blue shutters. You have a cat, right? A gray one. I see it sometimes when you come home from work." My breath caught in my throat. The way he spoke, so calmly, as if this was a normal conversation, made my skin crawl. I had never mentioned my cat or my address to anyone at work. I felt exposed, like I was standing in front of him completely naked. "Please," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "You need to leave. This isn't okay." He tilted his head, still smiling. "I just like to watch you. You work hard. It is fascinating." "Fascinating?" I echoed, incredulous. I took a step back, wanting to put distance between us. "That is creepy. You cannot just sit here and watch me work every night. It is not normal." "Normal is a matter of perspective," he replied, leaning forward slightly. "You should be careful. There are worse people than me out there." I turned to leave, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I didn't want to turn my back on him. I reached for the phone on the counter, my hands shaking. "I will call the police if you do not leave." "Go ahead," he said, unfazed. "I'll be here when you get back." I hurried to the back office, my heart pounding, and dialed 911. I explained the situation, my voice shaky as I tried to describe the man. They told me they would send someone, but it would take time. I didn't know if I could stay there alone until they arrived. I took a deep breath and decided I couldn't wait. I needed to get out. I glanced back at the man, who was still sitting there, still watching me, and I felt a rush of anger and fear. I grabbed my things, ready to leave, when I heard the door chime again. The man's eyes shifted to the entrance, and I turned as well. Another customer had come in, a young woman, probably in her 20s. She looked surprised to see me in such a panic, and I quickly waved to her. "I need to go. Can you please stay with him until the police arrive?" She nodded, looking concerned, and I dashed out the back door, my heart racing as I stepped into the cool night air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, desperate to lock the door behind me. I could still feel his eyes on me, the memory of that smile haunting me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing at the laundromat door, watching me leave. But there was nothing. Just the darkened windows of the laundromat and the night stretching out in front of me. The police called later that night to tell me they had found the man, but he had given them a false name and disappeared before they could get any real information. I never returned to that laundromat. I quit my job the next day, taking a position at a place with daytime hours. I thought about him often, that smile and those unsettling words. I never learned who he really was or why he had chosen to fixate on me. But I took every precaution when I got home, double-checking the locks and peering out the windows before settling in for the night. The memory of his voice still lingered, a reminder that sometimes the darkest things are not found in shadows or nightmares, but in the very real world around us. The office building was dead silent at night, the kind of quiet where you start to hear things that aren't there. I was used to it, though. I'd been doing night shift janitorial work for over 5 years, and it was usually peaceful work. Most people hated the night shift, but I liked being alone. Just me, my mop, and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I had my routine. First, the lobby, then the bathrooms, then the cubicles. Around 3 a.m., I go up to the top floor and start on the individual offices, working my way down. Most nights, every light in the place was off except the ones I turned on myself. There's a motion sensor system that shuts everything off automatically when everyone's gone. Except lately, there was this one office light that was always on when I got up to the 5th floor. I figured someone must have left it on by mistake. The 5th floor only had a few offices, mostly the higher-ups and some private meeting rooms, but I never saw anyone there after hours. The first time I noticed the light, I went in and turned it off. Didn't think anything of it. But the next night, it was on again. And the night after that. After the 4th or 5th time, I mentioned it to security. They just shrugged, saying maybe someone kept forgetting, or maybe there was a timer issue. Nothing to worry about, they said. I wasn't so sure. It was odd, and it made me a little uneasy, but I had a job to do, so I kept my head down and just went about my business. Then one night, around 3 a.m. like usual, I went up to the 5th floor, and sure enough, that light was on again. Only this time, as I pushed open the door, I felt something in the air. It was, I don't know, different. There was a tension that hadn't been there before, a kind of heavy stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the quiet getting to me. But as I started cleaning the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finished up in the hallway and moved toward the office with the light. The door was slightly ajar, and the light spilled out onto the carpet. I pushed it open, ready to turn off the light like I always did, but when I stepped inside, I froze. There was a person sitting at the desk. Just sitting there in the dark, no computer on, nothing on the desk, just them. They were sitting back in the chair, hands in their lap, staring straight ahead. It was a man, middle-aged maybe, with a blank expression on his face. His eyes looked a little glazed over, like he wasn't really seeing anything. Just staring. I cleared my throat, feeling like an idiot, but I couldn't just ignore him. "Ah, sir," I said. No response. Not even a blink. He just kept staring forward, like he didn't even know I was there. I took a step closer, feeling this weird mix of curiosity and dread. "Sir, you all right?" Nothing. Not a single reaction. His eyes didn't move, and he didn't even twitch. I tried to reason it out, thinking maybe he'd fallen asleep with his eyes open or something. I'd heard of that happening, though I'd never seen it myself. I thought about calling security, but something told me not to. I don't know why. It felt like if I called for help, it'd somehow make things worse. After a minute or two, I backed out of the room, keeping my eyes on him until I was back in the hallway. I shut the door and finished the rest of my cleaning as fast as I could. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from every shadow. I told myself it was just the creepiness of the whole situation, but it didn't help. I finished up my shift, practically ran down to the locker room, grabbed my stuff, and got out of there. When I got home, I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how I looked at it, it was just wrong. There was no reason for someone to be sitting in that dark office at 3 a.m, not moving, not reacting. And the way he stared, it didn't feel natural. The next night, I was on edge the whole time, and when I got to the 5th floor, I was half expecting that light to be on again. But it wasn't. The entire floor was dark, just like it should be. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment, like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but a part of me knew I hadn't. The next few nights, everything was normal. The light stayed off, and there was no sign of that man. I started to think it was some kind of weird one-time thing, maybe just a trick my mind had played on me. But then, about a week later, I was on the 5th floor again, and I saw it. The light in that same office was on. I stopped dead in the hallway, my heart racing. I didn't want to go in there, but I knew I had to. I couldn't ignore it, not after what I'd seen. I forced myself to walk to the door, half hoping it'd be empty this time. But when I pushed the door open, he was there again. Same man, same blank stare. He was sitting in the exact same position, hands in his lap, staring straight ahead. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Sir, you really shouldn't be here," I said, my voice shaky. I didn't expect him to respond, and he didn't. He just kept staring, that same lifeless expression on his face. I don't know what came over me, but I took a step closer, looking him right in the eyes. They were empty, hollow. There was no light in them, no sign of thought or emotion. Just nothing. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking. I didn't bother finishing my shift. I went straight to security, told them everything, even though I knew it sounded crazy. They promised they'd check it out, but I could tell they didn't believe me. The next night, I showed up for my shift, dreading going up to that floor. When I got there, I was relieved to see the light was off. But as I was cleaning the hallway, I felt that same heaviness in the air. That same feeling of being watched. I looked over my shoulder, and there he was. Standing in the doorway, just watching me. Not sitting, not staring blankly, but standing there, his eyes fixed on me. I dropped my mop and bolted down the hallway. I didn't look back, didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. I never went back. I quit the next day. I don't know who or what that man was. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel like he's watching me. Like his eyes are still on me, somewhere out there in the dark, waiting. I worked the night shift at a mortuary. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and there was a kind of peace to it. You're alone with the dead, and they don't ask for much. Just keep things tidy, make sure paperwork's in order, and stay out of the way of grieving families. One night, it was around 2 a.m., and I was logging in entries in the visitor's book. Most people don't come by late at night unless it's an emergency, so I was surprised when the front door buzzer went off. It was a man, probably in his 50s, dressed in a dark jacket, cap pulled low over his face. He looked tired but calm. "I'm here to see my sister," he said, and he sounded quiet, kind of sad. I asked for her name, and he said, "Margaret." I flipped through the log, but there was no Margaret on the list, at least not in the last few weeks. I asked him to wait and went to check the records. It's not unusual for someone to come in, thinking they had permission to see a relative only to find out there was a mix-up with the paperwork. But there was no record of any Margaret. I went back to the desk, told him there wasn't anyone by that name here, and he just stared at me, looking confused. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I was here just last week." I double-checked. Nothing. He sighed, looked like he was thinking something over, and then he thanked me and left. I felt a little sorry for him, thinking maybe he was just confused, or maybe it was the stress of grief. People forget things, or think they remember something that didn't happen. But then he came back the next night. Same time, same tired look on his face. Same request. He didn't seem frustrated or anything, just determined. "I'm here to see my sister, Margaret," he said again, like the night before hadn't even happened. I checked the logs, even though I knew I'd find the same result. No Margaret. No record of anyone related to him. I told him the same thing as the night before, that there was no one here by that name. He just nodded slowly, looking disappointed, and walked out without another word. After that, he showed up every night. Always around 2 a.m., always asking to see his sister. He'd sign the visitor's log each time, but there was never any paperwork to back up his visit. And every night, I had to tell him the same thing, there was no one here by that name. I started feeling uneasy about it. There was something strange about the way he looked at me. He didn't argue or complain. He just had this look, this fixed stare, like he was waiting for me to say something different, like he thought I was hiding something from him. One night, after he left, I decided to go through the records again. I dug back, weeks, months. No one named Margaret had been here in ages. But his signature was in the visitor's log every night for the past week. Every night, same time. The next night, I was ready to tell him he couldn't come back. I figured he was some poor guy who'd gotten his wires crossed, or maybe he had memory issues. I was nervous when he showed up again, same routine, same tired look. But this time, he seemed different. His eyes were a little wild, darting around the room like he was looking for something, or someone. He looked at me, almost pleading, and asked, "Are you sure?" "I know she's here. I just want to see her." I shook my head, tried to keep calm, but I felt something heavy settle in my chest. I told him no one by that name was here, that I checked. I could see his face tighten, his jaw clench. He didn't say anything, just nodded and laughed. But he looked back as he went out the door, and for a second, I thought I saw something in his eyes, a kind of anger. That was the first night I felt afraid. He didn't come the next night, and I thought maybe he'd finally gotten the message. But around 2 a.m., I went to log the entries, and I saw his signature there. Clear as day. Same looping scrawl, same time. I stared at it, trying to wrap my head around it. I hadn't seen him come in. The door buzzer hadn't gone off. I was the only one with a key, the only one on shift. But his name was in the log, just like it had been every night before. I checked the security footage, expecting to see him walk in like he always did. But there was nothing. Just me, sitting at the desk, the empty hallway behind me. I rewound, watched it again, trying to find something, anything. But there was no sign of him. The following night, I almost didn't want to go in, but I needed the job. I kept telling myself it was just a mistake, some kind of glitch, that I'd misremembered something. Around 2 a.m., the buzzer went off. I went to the door, and there he was, standing in the entryway. This time, he didn't even ask. He just stared at me, his eyes tired and dark, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "I know she's here," he whispered. "I know you're keeping her from me." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's no one by that name here. You have to leave." He didn't move. Just kept staring, like he was waiting for me to break. I tried to explain again, said I'd checked the records, that there was no Margaret. But he just shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on mine. "You don't understand," he whispered. "She's here. I saw her. I know she's here." I took a step back, feeling my heart race. "Please, you have to go," I said, louder this time. He didn't argue, didn't shout. Just looked at me, his face a mixture of sadness and anger, like he couldn't understand why I was lying to him. Then he turned and walked out, and I watched him disappear into the darkness outside. That was the last time I saw him. He never came back after that. But every night, at exactly 2 a.m., his signature would show up in the visitor's log, the same looping scrawl, as if he'd been there all along. I left the job not long after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, still looking for her, still waiting for someone to tell him the truth. And sometimes, late at night, I still feel like he's watching, like he's waiting for me to slip up, to finally tell him where she is. Working the night shift at the warehouse was usually pretty uneventful. Mostly it was me and a couple other guys loading and organizing pallets, getting everything ready for the morning. I liked the job because I could keep to myself, put in my earbuds, and just zone out for a few hours. No bosses, no customers, just a big, cold building and stacks of boxes. I started noticing weird things about 2 weeks into my shift. It was subtle at first. Little things that didn't seem to fit. One night, I was going through my normal routine, moving pallets of boxes to different areas in the warehouse. When I got to one, there was a single piece of paper lying on top of it, just a torn scrap. At first, I didn't think much of it, figuring it was a packing slip or something. But when I picked it up, there were words written on it, scribbled in messy handwriting. It said, "Good night, Alex." That was my name. I just kind of stood there, staring at it. It was late, and we don't get a lot of visitors or workers coming through here, especially at night. The only other person on shift was Eddie, and he was all the way over by the loading docks, nowhere near this section. He'd have no reason to come over here just to leave a note for me. And why would he? I shrugged it off and threw the paper away. Figured someone left it as a joke, or maybe it was left over from the day's shift. But when I went back to work the next night, there was another note on the exact same pallet. This one just had my full name, Alex Martin. Seeing my full name written out gave me a chill. Not just Alex this time, but my last name too. I asked Eddie if he was trying to mess with me, but he swore he didn't know anything about it. And honestly, Eddie wasn't the type. He was a quiet guy, always kept to himself, didn't talk much. He seemed as weirded out by it as I was. After that, it kept happening. Not every night, but enough to make me paranoid. A note here, a little scrap of paper there. Sometimes they just have my name, other times a random phrase like "how's your mom?" or "sleep well." One night, there was one that said, "I see you." At first, I tried ignoring it, but the notes didn't stop. They started getting more personal, like whoever was leaving them knew things about me. I found one that said, "Hope you're doing okay since the breakup." That one hit me hard because I'd just gone through a breakup a few months ago. It wasn't something I talked about with anyone at work, especially not on the night shift. After that, I started feeling uneasy all the time. Every noise made me jump. I started looking over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see someone watching me. But there was never anyone there. Just the quiet warehouse, the stacks of pallets, and the occasional distant hum of machinery. One night, I decided to keep an eye out, to see if I could catch whoever was doing it. I didn't have any idea how they were getting to the pallets without me seeing them. The notes always showed up in sections where I was working alone, areas Eddie had no reason to go near. Around midnight, I went to check one of the pallets where I'd found a note the night before. Sure enough, there was a new one waiting for me. It said, "You shouldn't be here." I felt my stomach drop when I read that. Something about those words felt hostile. Like whoever was leaving the notes was getting angry. I looked around, but there was nothing but shadows. The lights were dim, and the only sound was my own breathing. I was about to turn and go back to the main area when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I whipped around, but no one was there. The sound had come from just around the corner, in the next aisle over. I stood there, frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rows. No answer. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The footsteps kept coming, slow and steady, like whoever was there was taking their time, enjoying watching me squirm. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel someone there, lurking just out of sight. I turned and bolted back to the main area where Eddie was working. He looked at me, confused, as I came stumbling around the corner, out of breath. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hear what?" Eddie asked, looking genuinely puzzled. I didn't know what to say. It sounded ridiculous to explain that I heard footsteps when there was clearly no one else around. I tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just the building settling. Eddie shrugged and went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The notes kept coming, getting more personal, like whoever was leaving them knew everything about me. One of them said, "You left the door unlocked last night." Another one said, "Tell your brother to be careful on his way home." That one terrified me because my younger brother had just gotten his driver's license, and he drove home late from his night classes. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I didn't know if it was some twisted prank, or if someone was actually watching me, following me, somehow knowing every detail of my life. I started double-checking my car, locking my doors, making sure my phone wasn't being tracked. One night, I was working in the same section again, and I saw a new note on a pallet. I didn't want to read it, but I couldn't stop myself. I unfolded it slowly, hands shaking, and read the words. "Tonight's the night." That was it. Just those 3 words, but it felt like a threat. My chest tightened, and I could feel a cold sweat break out on my skin. I shoved the note in my pocket and tried to keep working, but my mind was racing. What did it mean? Was someone actually planning something, or was it just another sick joke? I decided I couldn't do it anymore. I went to the office, grabbed my stuff, and told Eddie I wasn't feeling well. I didn't tell him the truth, didn't tell him about the notes, or the footsteps, or the feeling that someone was out there, watching. He probably wouldn't have believed me anyway. That was my last night at the warehouse. I quit the next day, didn't even go back to pick up my last paycheck. I just didn't feel safe anymore, didn't feel like I could work there without constantly looking over my shoulder. But even now, months later, I still think about those notes, about the footsteps, about the way whoever was behind it seemed to know everything about me. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner, a place called Mel's. It wasn't fancy, mostly truckers and late-night regulars who came in after the bars closed. We got a few regulars who would sit around for hours, nursing a coffee or 2. I didn't mind them. It was nice to have some company in the quiet, empty hours between midnight and sunrise. There was this one guy, though. He'd started showing up around 1 a.m. about 2 months ago, always sitting in the same booth by the back wall. At first, he'd order coffee, maybe a slice of pie. He was quiet, kept to himself, didn't bother anyone. I figured he was just lonely. He was a bit older, maybe in his 40s, with short hair that was already starting to go gray, and this intense look in his eyes that made me uncomfortable if I looked at him too long. After a couple of weeks, I noticed he'd stopped ordering. He'd just come in, sit in his booth, and stare. He never asked for coffee anymore, didn't even touch a menu. He'd just sit there, watching me. Every time I passed by, I'd feel his eyes follow me all the way across the diner. I started to dread his visits. I'd try to keep busy, give him a smile as I walked past, but he never smiled back. Just sat there, watching. One night, around 2 a.m., I walked over and asked if he wanted anything. He didn't say a word, just kept staring, his eyes locked on me like he was waiting for something. I gave him a little nod and backed off, feeling this cold prickle at the base of my neck. After that, I tried to ignore him. I'd sweep the floors, wipe down the counters, go back into the kitchen whenever I could to avoid looking at him. I didn't tell anyone about him, though I thought about asking my manager, Frank, to come down and talk to the guy. But Frank didn't usually show up until morning, and he'd probably just tell me to suck it up, that he was just another customer. I started clocking the time whenever the guy came in, hoping he'd leave soon. But he didn't. One night, around 4 a.m., I realized he hadn't left at all. I was wiping down the tables when I glanced over at his booth and saw him, still sitting there. His hands were folded on the table, his eyes following me with that same unblinking stare. I was pretty sure he hadn't moved all night. I tried to act normal, pretend like he wasn't bothering me. I'd cleaned every table twice, even scrubbed the counters, just to keep myself busy. Around 5 a.m., I went back to the kitchen to grab some more sugar packets for the counter. When I came out, he was gone. Relief washed over me, and I felt stupid for letting him get to me. Maybe he'd finally taken the hint. But then, a few minutes later, I heard a sound by the back door. It was a soft shuffling, like someone was moving around just outside. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a stray animal. But the noise didn't stop. It was this slow, scraping sound, and then the handle of the back door jiggled. I stood there, heart pounding, as the doorknob twisted back and forth. I was about to yell out when the sound stopped. Everything went quiet again, so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I stepped closer to the door, trying to listen, and then I heard a voice. Low, almost a whisper, coming from the other side. "Are you alone in there?" I froze, trying to keep my breathing steady, hoping he couldn't hear how scared I was. I didn't answer. He spoke again, voice softer this time. "I see you're all alone." That was when I lost it. I ran up to the front of the diner and locked the door, just in case he tried to come around the front. I could see through the windows into the parking lot, but there was no sign of him. Just the empty lot and the glow of the streetlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. For the next hour, I stayed up front, trying to keep myself busy, watching the clock until it was time for my shift to end. I was jumpy, feeling like I was being watched even when I was alone in the room. When my shift finally ended, I grabbed my stuff and darted out the front door, barely stopping to lock up. I didn't see him anywhere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still around, lurking somewhere in the shadows. I told myself I'd just call in sick the next night, let someone else cover my shift. But then I thought about the money, about the bills piling up, and I talked myself out of it. It was just one creepy guy. I could handle it, right? But when I showed up the next night, he was there again, sitting in his booth like nothing had happened. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the floor as I walked past him. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed me, his gaze heavy and unblinking. I could feel it every time I turned my back. Around 3 a.m., I was refilling the napkin dispensers when I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He didn't move, just stood there, blocking the way, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I managed to say, my voice shaky. He tilted his head, that same blank look in his eyes. "Are you alone tonight?" I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. I didn't answer, just turned and walked back to the front, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me, his face expressionless. After what felt like hours, he finally turned and walked back to his booth. I kept working, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds to make sure he was still there. Around 5 a.m., I heard the same shuffling noise coming from the back door. This time, it was louder, like someone was dragging something heavy. My heart pounded as I listened, straining to hear over the hum of the appliances. The shuffling stopped, and then, in the silence, I heard his voice again, low and calm. "I know you're alone." That was it. I grabbed my stuff, ran out the front, and didn't look back. I didn't care about locking up, didn't care if I got in trouble with Frank. I just wanted to get out of there. I never went back after that. Frank called me a few times, leaving voicemails asking if I was okay, saying I needed to pick up my last check. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't face the thought of seeing that man again, of feeling his eyes on me, knowing he'd be there, waiting. I still think about him sometimes, wonder if he still goes to Mel's, still sits in that same booth, watching, waiting. Maybe he found someone else to watch. But every now and then, late at night, I hear that shuffling noise outside my apartment, that soft voice whispering, asking if I'm alone. I worked the night shift at a parking garage downtown. Not the most exciting job, but it was decent money, and I didn't have to deal with too many people, which suited me just fine. It was mostly business types coming in and out during the day, but by night, it got pretty empty. just a few late-night stragglers who'd forgotten where they parked, or people on their way out after a long shift. My job was to keep an eye on things, check the cameras, make sure no one was breaking into the cars. There was a small booth I worked out of on the ground floor near the entrance. Just me, a chair, a tiny desk with a monitor hooked up to the security cameras, and a vending machine that only took exact change. The garage itself had 5 floors, with dim lighting, so shadows seemed to stretch everywhere. Sound carried strangely in there, echoing down the ramps and bouncing off the concrete walls. A few months into the job, I started noticing something weird. Every now and then, I hear footsteps. At first, I'd think it was just a late-night driver heading to their car, but then I'd look at the monitor, and there'd be no one on any of the cameras. It wasn't constant, just every so often, usually in the dead quiet of the early hours when the place was completely empty. Sometimes it'd sound like they were just a floor above me, sometimes closer, like they were right around the corner. I'd hear them, pause, wait for the person to appear on one of the cameras, but no one ever did. One night, I got curious and decided to go up and check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up to the second floor. The echo of my own footsteps bounced off the walls, making the place feel twice as big and twice as empty. I walked up the ramps, my light cutting through the shadows, but I didn't see anything. It was just quiet, with the low hum of the lights buzzing overhead. Then, as I turned to head back down, I heard footsteps, soft but steady, coming from the 3rd floor above me. I froze, trying to listen, my heart pounding a little faster. They sounded slow, like someone just strolling along, not in any hurry. I took a breath and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice echoed back at me, but there was no answer. The footsteps just stopped. I waited a minute, listening, but everything was silent again. I told myself it was probably just a sound carrying from the street outside, or maybe some kind of weird echo. I shrugged it off and went back to the booth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After that, the footsteps became more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear them a couple of times a night, always when I was alone, always when the garage was empty. They'd start out faint, then get closer, like someone was making their way down to the ground floor. I checked the cameras, scanned the floors, but there was never anyone there. One night, around 3 a.m., it happened again. I was in the booth, half asleep, when I heard the footsteps. This time, they sounded like they were right outside the booth. I shot up, heart racing, and looked out through the glass. The garage was empty. But the footsteps were still there, moving away from me now, heading toward the back of the garage. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and shone the beam down the row of parked cars. Nothing. Is someone there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I stood there for a minute, feeling stupid, waiting for something to happen. But the footsteps had stopped again. The garage was silent. I decided to do a full sweep of the place, just to put my mind at ease. I walked up each level, shining my light into every corner, checking behind the pillars and parked cars. Everything was still, empty. When I got to the 5th floor, I stopped for a minute to catch my breath. The whole place was dead silent, not even a car engine humming in the distance. Then, just as I was about to head back down, I heard a voice. It was soft, like someone talking to themselves, muttering, but it echoed off the concrete, and I couldn't make out what they were saying. My stomach twisted as I slowly turned, shining my light down the rows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The muttering stopped. I took a few steps forward, peering around a pillar, and that's when I saw him. A man was crouched down between 2 parked cars, his back to me. He was wearing dark clothes, his head down, hands fidgeting with something I couldn't see. "Hey!" I called out, a bit louder this time. He didn't respond, didn't even turn to look at me. I took another step forward, keeping my flashlight on him. What are you doing here? He finally turned his head, just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were wide, staring at me with this intense, almost hungry look. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just looked right at me, like he was sizing me up. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Waiting for me? What do you mean? He didn't answer, just kept staring at me. I took a step back, my hand gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. "You need to leave," I said, trying to sound firm. "This is private property. You can't be here." He stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact. "I've seen you here, every night," he said. "You don't know it, but I've been watching." My mouth went dry. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else, but it was just the two of us, alone on the top floor of an empty parking garage. "Look," I said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but you need to go. Now." He took a step toward me, and I felt my heart hammering against my chest. "I know things about you," he whispered. "Things you don't even know about yourself." That was enough for me. I took another step back, turning to make a run for the stairs. But before I could move, I heard him laugh, a low, chilling sound that echoed off the walls. "You can't run from me," he said, his voice following me down the stairwell as I bolted down to the lower levels. I didn't stop until I was back at the booth, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I grabbed my phone and called the cops, barely able to get the words out as I told them there was a man in the garage, someone who shouldn't be there, someone who'd been following me. They said they'd send someone over right away, told me to stay in the booth and keep the door locked. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the monitor. The camera showed all the floors, but I couldn't see him anywhere. Just empty concrete, silent and still. I kept watching, my eyes darting from screen to screen, waiting for him to appear. When the cops finally arrived, they did a full sweep of the garage, checking every floor, every corner. But they didn't find anyone. No sign of a man, no footprints, nothing. They told me he was probably just some homeless guy, someone looking for a place to sleep. But I knew it was more than that. The way he looked at me, the things he said, it felt personal. After that night, I quit. I couldn't go back to that garage, couldn't stand the thought of being there alone, listening to those footsteps, waiting for him to find me again. Even now, I sometimes feel like he's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And every now and then, late at night, I swear I can hear footsteps, following me, just out of sight. I was on night shift for a construction job at an old hotel. The place had been shut down for years, long before I even came to town. We'd been called in to strip it down before it got fully renovated, but this place had been through a lot. Windows boarded up, walls cracked and peeling, whole floors that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. It was just me on site most nights, just moving rubble, stripping paint, getting things ready for the crew in the morning. On that particular night, I just finished hauling some debris down to the basement when I heard it. Someone called my name. It wasn't loud, but it was clear as anything. "Jack," it said, just like that, like someone standing right behind me. I turned fast, expecting to see one of the guys. I knew I was the only one there, but in a place like that, sound carried weirdly. I didn't see anyone, of course. Just dark, empty hallways leading off in both directions. I brushed it off, thought maybe it was the wind or something. The place had been rotting from the inside out for decades, wind whistling through gaps in the walls, all that. I went back to my work, trying not to think about how my name had sounded, almost like a whisper, right in my ear. I'd barely picked up my tools when I heard it again, a little louder this time. Jack. I stood there, just listening. It was like whoever it was had moved a little further down the hall. It made me think maybe someone was messing with me. One of the guys from the morning crew could have stayed late to pull a prank or something, hiding in the shadows. It wasn't a bad place for it, plenty of dark corners and empty rooms. But as I went to call out, my voice echoed down the hall, unanswered. My skin started to crawl a little, but I tried to keep working. After all, this wasn't the first weird thing I'd experienced working late nights alone in an old building. I get paid, finish my job, and get the hell out. But every so often, just when I thought I was safe, I hear it again, the voice calling my name from different spots in the building. Once it sounded like it was coming from the second floor, then down the hall. It was like someone was following me but staying just out of reach, making sure I knew they were there. I decided I'd had enough. I went back to the main hall to gather up my tools and get out. But when I got there, my toolbox was gone. Now, I know I'd left it by the staircase I'd used to hammer just 10 minutes before. But the whole box had disappeared, like someone had snatched it up the second I turned my back. I looked around, feeling the hairs on my neck start to stand up. It's one thing to hear a voice, to think you're maybe imagining it, but your tools? Those don't just vanish on their own. I walked back to the basement, figuring maybe I'd put it down without realizing. Sure enough, when I got to the basement, there it was, sitting in the middle of the room, like it had been waiting for me. Tools scattered out, just lying there like someone had gone through them. I didn't touch it. Just stood there, staring at it, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. I wanted to leave right then, but I still had to pack up my tools and lock up. I reached down, started tossing everything back into the box, and that's when I heard my name again, closer this time. Jack. Just a whisper, but it made my skin go cold. I grabbed my toolbox and headed up the stairs, fast as I could. I was done playing games with whatever was in there. As I got to the main hall, though, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. My ladder had been moved. I'd left it leaning against the wall by the stairwell, but now it was in the middle of the hall, lying flat, blocking my way to the door. I walked over and dragged it aside, my hand shaking as I shoved it against the wall. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I'd moved it and forgot. But that didn't explain the voice, or the toolbox, or how the ladder ended up blocking my path. I was just about to reach the door when I heard it again, right by my ear. Jack. This time, it was louder, clear enough to make me jump. I turned around, expecting to see someone right there, but the hall was empty. I could feel my heart hammering as I scanned the shadows, half expecting something to jump out at me. I ran for the door, wrenching it open, but as I stepped out into the night air, I felt like I was leaving something behind. Like I was being watched from the shadows, someone just waiting for me to come back. The next morning, I told the site manager what happened. He just laughed, said I was probably just tired, that maybe the place was getting to me. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. I never took the night shift again. I wasn't going back into that building, not after that. I was working the night shift at a small animal clinic, just me and the animals for hours on end. It was always dead quiet after 10 p.m., just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle from one of the kennels in the back. I didn't mind, though. I'd get paperwork done, prep for surgeries, make sure everything was stocked for the morning. Sometimes I'd even bring a book to pass the time if it was really slow. But then the calls started coming. It was late one night, just after midnight, and the clinic's phone rang. That wasn't unusual. We sometimes got emergency calls from people who didn't know where else to go. I picked up and said the usual, "This is Valley Animal Clinic, how can I help you?" But there was silence on the other end. Just dead air. I could hear faint breathing, or maybe it was static, I couldn't tell. I repeated myself, waited a few seconds, but then the call just ended. I figured maybe it was a prank or a wrong number. I let it go and went back to what I was doing. But then it happened again the next night. This time, though, I could hear a man's voice. He sounded strange, like he was out of breath, or maybe just tired. He said something about his dog, how it was hurt, needed help. I asked him to bring the dog in, told him I'd be waiting. There was a pause, like he was deciding what to do, and then he hung up without another word. I waited that night, but no one came. I stayed at the front desk for another hour, just in case, but there was nothing. No one came, and no one called back. The next night, it happened again. This time, he sounded more desperate. Said his dog was bleeding, that it was bad, that he needed help. I kept calm, told him to bring the dog in right away, that I'd be ready. I gave him directions, repeated them, but he didn't seem to hear me. He kept saying he was coming, that he was on his way. But just like before, he never showed. The calls kept coming every night, usually around the same time. The stories would change. Sometimes it was a cat, sometimes it was a rabbit. Once he even said he had an injured bird. I was starting to get frustrated. I told my manager, but she just brushed it off, said it was probably some lonely person who just wanted someone to talk to. I almost believed her, but something didn't sit right. The man's voice, the way he'd talk about these animals, it was like he was holding back, like there was something he wasn't telling me. Then, one night, the call came again, but this time, he said he was already outside. I felt a chill run down my spine. I went to the front door and looked out into the parking lot. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then I caught a figure standing by the streetlight, holding a small cage. He didn't move, just stood there, staring straight at me through the glass door. I waited a second, then opened the door a crack and called out to him, asking if he needed help. He didn't answer right away, just stood there like he hadn't even heard me. I was about to call out again when he finally stepped forward, carrying the cage in both hands like it was something precious. As he got closer, I could see his face better. He looked tired, bags under his eyes, skin pale under the harsh lights. He handed me the cage without saying anything, just shoved it into my hands. I looked down, expecting to see an animal inside, but the cage was empty. I looked back at him, confused, and asked him where the animal was. He didn't answer, just kept staring at me with this strange look, like he was waiting for me to do something. I asked him again, a bit firmer this time, where the animal was, if he'd brought it in another cage or maybe left it in his car. He shook his head slowly, like he didn't understand the question. Finally, he muttered something about how I wasn't supposed to see it yet, whatever that meant. I told him I couldn't help him if there was no animal, that he'd need to go home and bring it in. He didn't seem to hear me, though. He just kept looking at the cage, then at me, then back at the cage, like he was waiting for something to happen. Finally, I put the cage down and told him he needed to leave, that I couldn't help him. He didn't react, just stared at me, unblinking. I was about to call for backup, but then he turned and walked away, leaving the empty cage on the counter. I locked the door behind him and watched as he disappeared into the darkness. The cage was still sitting there, empty and cold, like some strange reminder of what had just happened. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that cage, the way he'd handed it to me, the look in his eyes. The next morning, I told my manager again, told her everything this time. She said she'd look into it, maybe call the cops if he showed up again. But days went by, and I didn't hear anything more. No calls, no strange men at the door, nothing. I thought maybe it was over, that he finally decided to leave me alone. But then, a week later, I came in for my shift, and the cage was back, sitting on the counter, right where he'd left it. This time, though, there was something inside, a single scrap of paper, folded up and tucked into the corner. I picked it up, unfolded it, and there, in messy handwriting, was my name. I was working nights out at the old lighthouse on the coast, stationed there for a stretch to keep an eye on things, manage the lights, and make sure everything was in good order. It was just me, the waves, and the beam sweeping out into the dark. There wasn't much else around, a few distant houses along the cliffs and some fishing boats further out, but I rarely saw anyone, especially at night. I liked it, though. There was a calmness to it, a solitude I didn't get much anywhere else. The only sounds were the hum of the machinery, the ocean, and the occasional cry of a bird. A few weeks in, though, I started noticing something strange. There was this small boat that would show up every night, tied up at the dock at the base of the cliffs. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone stopping off to rest or fish in the dark, but there was never anyone around it. I'd go down to the dock sometimes, flashlight sweeping over the empty boat, but there were no signs of people. No fishing gear, no supplies. Just an empty, worn-down boat, bobbing on the water. I'd check around, call out, shine my light into the shadows along the shore, but nothing. Then in the morning, it would be gone, like it had never been there at all. It was odd, but I tried not to think much of it. Figured it was maybe some local playing a joke, tying their boat up in the middle of the night to mess with the lighthouse keeper. But then one night, I came up to check on the lantern room, and the boat was there again. Same spot, tied to the dock below. I went down to take a look, just in case I could catch whoever was playing this game with me. I shined my light around, called out, but no one responded. It was cold that night, the air sharp and damp. I stood there, looking out over the water for a while, trying to see if maybe someone was swimming nearby or hiding on the shore, but it was dead quiet. Just the sound of waves lapping at the boat. That night, I went back up to the lighthouse and locked the door behind me. I don't usually do that, but there was something about the quiet, the empty boat, it just felt wrong. I tried to shake it off, but I was jumpy, kept glancing out the window as I climbed the stairs back to the light. I didn't sleep much that night. When I finally dozed off in the small room below the lantern, I kept hearing things, like footsteps on the stairs, or creaking on the lower levels. I told myself it was the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring out the window, checking the dock every hour or so. But by morning, the boat was gone again. The next night, I almost expected it. And sure enough, there it was, docked in the exact same place, bobbing gently on the waves. I didn't go down this time. I just watched it from the window, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I didn't need to make a big deal out of it. But then, as I watched, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving in the boat. I felt my skin go cold. I kept staring, waiting to see if it would move again. But whatever it was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that something had been there, watching me. I locked the door again that night, double-checking it this time. I went back up to my room, trying to focus on anything else. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something, a creak from down below, like someone stepping lightly on the stairs. I held my breath, listening, but it was silent again. Just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard another sound, this time closer. My skin prickled, and I sat up, trying to listen through the walls. It sounded like someone was walking up the stairs, moving slowly, carefully. I stayed still, my heart pounding, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer. Whoever it was, they were coming up toward me. I checked the door to the lantern room and realized I hadn't locked it. I stood there for a moment, deciding what to do. Then I grabbed the small flashlight I kept with me and moved toward the door, trying to stay as quiet as I could. As I reached for the door, I heard a soft rustling behind it. Someone was standing just on the other side. I stood there, my hand frozen, heart hammering in my chest. Then, slowly, I opened the door a crack, just enough to peer through. In the darkness, I could make out a figure, hunched over, rifling through my things, my backpack, my coat, even my food supplies. I watched, hardly daring to breathe. Whoever it was, they were so focused on going through my things, they didn't even notice I was there. I couldn't see much of their face, but they were muttering something under their breath, talking to themselves as they dug through my stuff, like they were looking for something. I caught a few words here and there, things like should be here and need to find it, but none of it made any sense. I felt trapped, caught between wanting to confront them and knowing that was a bad idea. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the floor. All I could think about was getting out, putting some distance between me and whoever this was. I waited, hoping they'd get what they wanted and leave. After a while, they stopped, standing up straight. For a terrifying moment, they turned toward the door, and I saw their face clearly. There was something unsettling in their eyes, something vacant and focused all at once. They didn't look at me, though, just at the door itself, like they knew it was there but not what was behind it. I pulled back slowly, then crept down the stairs as quietly as I could. I didn't want them to hear me, didn't want to risk drawing any attention. I got to the base of the lighthouse and out the door before I even realized I was holding my breath. I didn't stop until I was down by the dock, and I kept my flashlight off, just crouched there, trying to calm down, trying to think. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw them leave. They came out of the lighthouse, walking slowly, almost casually, as if they hadn't just broken in and gone through my things. They moved toward the dock and got into the small boat, untying it and drifting off into the darkness, like they hadn't even seen me. I went back up to the lighthouse, locked everything up, and stayed awake until morning. I reported it to my supervisor the next day, told him everything, but they never found the guy or figured out who he was. The boat never showed up again after that. But every time I work a night shift now, I keep looking out at the dock, waiting to see that small boat, tied up in the dark, and wondering if he'll be back. I worked at this small, old theater. It wasn't a chain or anything fancy, just one of those quiet places in town that people forget about. They kept me on night shifts, alone most of the time since not many folks came in that late. It was pretty peaceful, just me and the projector, the seats, the quiet hall. It started one Wednesday, a night like any other. We had only one show scheduled, and when it finished, the last people trickled out, and I started the routine cleanup. I was sweeping the aisles, picking up popcorn and empty cups, when I spotted a ticket on one of the seats. That wasn't unusual, people left them all the time. But as I leaned down to grab it, I noticed my name printed on it. No mistake. My first name and last, plain as day, along with a seat number in the corner, H7. My first thought was that it was just some weird mix-up. Maybe someone with the same name, or maybe someone in the printer room thought it would be funny to use my name. I shook my head, slipped the ticket in my pocket, and got back to cleaning. The next night, I found another one, this time on seat D4. Same thing, my full name, clear as day. Now I was curious and a bit on edge. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone, but I was thinking someone was pulling a prank on me, leaving tickets to mess with me. Maybe another worker had seen me, and this was their way of playing around. When I found the third one 2 nights later, my skin started crawling. I was already feeling a little weird about being alone in the theater, and this ticket wasn't helping. This one was in J10. No matter how many times I checked the seating chart, those seats didn't match up with anything we were running that night. In fact, I realized these tickets weren't even for real shows. At this point, I was just keeping my head down and trying to finish my shift without letting the tickets get to me. I made sure to lock up the place tight, checked every corner, every room, feeling like I was walking around waiting for something to jump out. Then, on Friday night, I was sweeping between the seats in the dark theater when I saw him. Sitting in J10, the same seat on the last ticket. He was just there, slouched in his seat, facing the blank screen. I stared for a good 10 seconds, trying to get my brain to understand what I was seeing. We hadn't sold any tickets for this show, and I was the only one on duty that night. I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence, but he didn't move. I called out, "Sir, we're closed. You need to leave." No response. I took a step closer, feeling my heart race. He was just a shadow in the dim light, but I could see his hands clasped in his lap, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was waiting for something to start on the screen. I took another step, this time close enough to see that his eyes were open, staring straight ahead. "Sir, I need you to leave." I tried again, but nothing. Not a word, not even a blink. My stomach tightened, and something told me not to get any closer. I backed out of the theater and shut the door behind me, locking it up. I wasn't sure what to do, so I went back to the front desk and dialed my manager. I waited for what felt like ages until he finally picked up. I told him there was a guy who wouldn't leave and that he wasn't responding, and I couldn't handle it alone. He said he'd head over, told me to wait out in the lobby until he got there, and not to go back in the theater. I hung up and tried to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes in the dark. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting him to suddenly be standing behind me, watching. I kept telling myself he was just some guy who had passed out or something, but it didn't feel right. There was something wrong about him, something off that I couldn't explain. When my manager got there, I walked with him back to the theater. I was half hoping the guy would be gone, that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But no, he was still there, sitting perfectly still, eyes fixed on the blank screen. My manager called out to him, louder than I had, but there was no reaction. He finally walked down the aisle, closer to the guy than I dared to get. He leaned in, and that's when I saw it. The man's lips were moving, barely, whispering something. My manager must have heard him too, because he went still, just staring at the guy. Then he backed up slowly, his face pale, and motioned for me to follow him out. "Let's just leave him. I'll call someone to deal with it," he muttered as we walked out of the theater, locking the door behind us. He didn't explain any further, just said it was best if we left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my head. The guy, sitting there like he was waiting for something that would never come. The way he whispered, like he was speaking to someone that wasn't there. The next day, I came back to work, half dreading what I'd find. My manager told me the guy was gone by the time someone came to check. But that wasn't all. There was a ticket on the desk when I came in, my name printed on it, just like before. Only this time, there was a new seat number, B5. I work night shifts as an engineer at this old facility. It's mostly maintenance and monitoring equipment, making sure everything's running smooth, not much action. The place is huge, too, with a lot of rooms, mostly empty. It's quiet, empty, just me and the machines humming all night. I usually didn't mind it. I got used to the silence, the solitude. Then about a week ago, I started hearing this tapping noise in the control room. It was faint, barely there at first. A soft, slow tap tap tap, like a finger drumming on metal or glass. I thought it was maybe a machine vibrating somewhere nearby. The building's old, and noises come with it, so I didn't think too much of it at first. It would start, then stop, then start again, irregularly. It was just enough to put me on edge. By the third night, it was getting under my skin. I'd be sitting there, trying to concentrate on the monitors, and the tapping would come back, just this gentle tap 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 from somewhere behind me. It would echo around the room, bouncing off the walls, hard to pinpoint. Every time I turned around, it'd stop. I'd listen, hold my breath, waiting to catch it again, but it wouldn't start up again until I turned back to my work. One night, it got louder, clear enough that I felt like it was coming from right behind me. I whipped around in my chair, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing. Just empty monitors and the big window behind me, looking out over the factory floor. Just blackness outside, and my own reflection in the glass. I'd get up, walk around the room, tap on different surfaces, trying to recreate the sound. I couldn't get it quite right, though. Nothing I tapped on had that same sharp, deliberate rhythm. I started wondering if maybe I was just hearing things, but every time I'd almost convince myself it was in my head, there it'd be again, tap tap tap. By the end of the week, I was starting to lose it. I'd barely slept, barely eaten. I was on edge every second, waiting for that sound to start. I'd catch myself staring at the window, feeling like something was looking back at me from the dark. That night, I heard the tapping louder than ever. I spun around, staring out through the glass. I could have sworn I saw movement outside, just the faintest flicker of something moving, right in the shadows near the corner of the room. My heart was pounding, but I tried to play it cool. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to the factory floor. I shone the light around, sweeping it across every corner, checking behind every stack of equipment, every shadowed spot. Nothing. The whole place was empty, silent, only the faint hum of machinery and the sound of my own breathing. But the feeling that someone had been there lingered. When I went back into the control room, the tapping started up again, clear as ever, like it was mocking me. This time, I went straight for the window, pressed my face up to the glass, peering out into the dark. That's when I realized the tapping wasn't coming from inside the room, it was coming from the other side of the window. I stumbled back, cold running through me. There was no way up to that window from the outside, it was a few stories up. There shouldn't be anyone on the other side. But as I backed up, the tapping started again, louder, like it was following me. I locked myself in the control room for the rest of the shift, feeling watched the whole time. Every now and then, I'd catch a flash of movement from the corner of my eye, just outside the window. I'd turn and see nothing but darkness, the faint outline of my own reflection in the glass, but I knew something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light. When my shift ended, I practically ran out of there, feeling stupid but too freaked out to care. The next night, I was hesitant to even come in, but I convinced myself it was just some weird noise, maybe a loose pipe or something. I'd deal with it. Halfway through my shift, I heard it again, but this time it was louder, and it didn't stop. It was constant, a steady rhythm like someone drumming their fingers, fast and deliberate. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and stomped outside, determined to prove to myself it was nothing. When I got outside, I scanned the building, checking every window, every corner. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure pressed up against the control room window, their hand flat on the glass. I froze, watching as they slowly turned and looked straight at me. Even in the dark, I could see their eyes, wide and staring, like they'd been waiting for me to notice them. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and the figure moved away from the window, disappearing into the shadows. I ran back inside, locking the doors behind me. I felt like I was going insane, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was someone out there, watching me, waiting for me. For the rest of my shift, I stayed in the control room, keeping the door locked and my back to the wall, refusing to go near the windows. The tapping started up again, soft and steady, just on the other side of the glass. I didn't look this time. I didn't want to see that face again, those eyes watching me, waiting. When my shift finally ended, I grabbed my stuff and ran out of there. I haven't been back since. I don't know who or what was out there, but I don't think it's gone. Every time I walk by the building now, I feel eyes on me, like someone's watching from the windows, just waiting for me to come back. I had been working the night shift at the rural bus depot for almost a year. The hours were long and quiet, filled mostly with the soft hum of the vending machine and the occasional radio chatter from the buses out on the routes. Most nights, I had the place to myself, save for the few drivers coming in for their breaks or dropping off paperwork. I got used to the silence and darkness that enveloped the depot after hours. It all started about a month ago. I noticed something odd one evening when I went to get into my car after my shift. It was parked under the flickering light by the entrance. I saw handprints smudged across the windshield and the driver's side window. They were small and dirty, too small to be from an adult, and I felt an uneasy chill run down my spine. At first, I thought maybe a kid had been playing around, but the thought didn't sit well with me. I wiped the glass clean, shrugged it off, and drove home. The next night, the handprints were back. They were in the same places as before. I was more alert this time, checking my surroundings, but I didn't see anyone. I looked around the empty lot, the shadows stretching in odd directions, but I still found nothing. I told myself that it was probably just a prank. Maybe some kids had found their way into the lot during the day and left the prints there. I convinced myself not to worry. But then, it kept happening. Each night, I would find those same handprints waiting for me. Each time, I felt a creeping sense of dread wash over me, but I would clean them off and try to forget it. On the nights when the prints were there, I was more on edge than usual, listening for sounds in the quiet, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. About 2 weeks in, I decided to report it to my boss. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I felt like I should mention it. He brushed it off, said it was probably just some kids messing around. He assured me that it was nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe him, but the next night the handprints were back again, and now they were smudged even worse, as if someone had been pressing their whole face against the glass, looking in. I began to dread my shifts. My nerves were frayed, and I couldn't concentrate on my work. I felt like I was being stalked by something unseen. I started double-checking the locks on the office doors, making sure the security cameras were working, even though I felt ridiculous. It was just me, the depot, and the darkness. Then came that night, the night everything changed. It was late, around 2 in the morning. I had just finished a call for a bus that was running late. I looked out the window, and everything was still. The lot was empty, the buses quiet, shadows stretching in the pale moonlight. I took a moment to breathe, trying to shake off the anxiety that had become my constant companion. I decided to step outside for some fresh air, hoping it would calm my nerves. I walked to my car, feeling uneasy but determined to find some peace. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced at the bus parked next to mine. It was one of the older models, the kind that made a lot of noise when they rolled down the street. The door was slightly ajar, and I saw a dim light flickering inside. My heart raced. I walked closer, peering into the bus. The seats were empty, but then I noticed a figure in the back, partially hidden in the shadows. It was hard to see clearly, but I could make out the outline of a man. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, facing away from me. I called out, trying to sound confident. "Hey, is someone in there?" There was no response. I felt my throat tighten. I stepped back, preparing to turn and run if I needed to. "Hello?" I tried again, a bit louder. The figure shifted slightly but did not turn around. I felt a surge of panic. I knew I should call the police or at least go back inside the office, but my feet were frozen. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, drowning out the silence around me. I took a step back, still keeping my eyes on the bus, when suddenly the figure turned to face me. I caught a glimpse of his face, pale and gaunt, eyes wide and hollow. I could feel fear seeping into my bones as I backed away, stumbling a little as I did. I quickly turned and ran back to the office, my heart racing like a drum. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed the police. I could still feel the weight of that stare, as if he was watching me, waiting. I waited for the dispatcher to answer, and I tried to explain what had happened, but it all came out in a jumble. "Please send someone," I finally said, my voice trembling. "There's a man in the bus. I think he's watching me." I glanced outside, but the bus was dark again, the light inside extinguished. I couldn't see the figure anymore, and the silence felt oppressive. The police arrived shortly after. I led them to the bus, but when they searched it, they found nothing. No man, no signs of anyone. I felt like a fool, explaining my fears, but the officers were kind, assuring me that they would patrol the area. They left, and I stayed locked in the office, waiting for dawn to break. When the sun finally rose, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't find any handprints that day, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining things. I took a deep breath, feeling foolish for letting my imagination get the best of me. But that evening, I saw it again. As I approached my car after my shift, there they were, new handprints, fresh and dirty on my windows. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stood there, the realization washing over me that I wasn't imagining anything. Someone was watching me. The next morning, I put in for a transfer to a different shift, a different location. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, still waiting. I didn't want to work nights anymore. The thought of those handprints, that figure in the bus, kept me awake at night. I hoped that if I changed my schedule, I could finally find some peace. I left that depot behind, but I would never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone had been there, waiting in the dark. I had worked as a press operator for a little over 3 years. The job was simple enough. I handled the printing press at a small printing company. The nights were usually quiet, just me and the hum of the machines, with the occasional click of the fax machine in the corner. I preferred the night shifts. There was something comforting about the darkness outside, the feeling of being the only one awake when the world slept. One night, everything changed. It started when I noticed something odd on the printed sheets coming off the press. The designs were different, almost erratic. At first, I thought it was just a glitch in the system. The patterns looked like random symbols, jumbled together without any meaning. I set them aside, intending to fix the issue in the morning. As the night went on, I kept seeing those same sheets piling up. I tried to focus on my work, but my curiosity got the better of me. I flipped through the stack. the symbols began to form recognizable shapes, like letters. I squinted at them, trying to make sense of it all. There were letters that seemed to spell words, but they were mixed in with the symbols, and it was hard to read. Then, I noticed something chilling. Some of the phrases were oddly familiar. They were details about my life that I had never shared with anyone at work. The first one I caught read, "You hate Mondays." I blinked, trying to shake off the creeping unease that started to settle in my stomach. I had mentioned that once, casually, to a coworker during lunch, but it was not something I discussed regularly. I set the papers aside and tried to concentrate on my tasks. I rolled the ink and adjusted the settings on the press, but my mind kept drifting back to those strange prints. I pulled out the sheets again, flipping through them faster this time, searching for more of those words. My heart raced as I read, "You don't like the coffee here." That one stung. I had said it just last week, joking with the other press operators about how bad it was. Feeling unnerved, I took a break and stepped outside for some air. The night was still and quiet, the stars twinkling against the black sky. I tried to clear my head, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But as I went back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around the shop, but everything seemed normal, the machines quietly humming. When I returned to my station, I found more sheets stacked up, the symbols now forming entire sentences. "You miss your family." My breath caught in my throat. I had not spoken about them in a long time, not even to my closest friends at work. I started to feel like I was in a twisted game where someone else knew too much about me. The unsettling feeling deepened. I looked around the shop again, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone, anyone who might be playing this sick prank. The dim light made everything feel shadowy and uncertain. I wanted to call out, to ask if someone was there, but fear kept me silent. Instead, I kept working, but my focus was shot. Each new sheet sent chills through me as they continued to reveal things I had never shared. "You can't sleep at night," read one. "You don't like the way your boss treats you," said another. I felt my heart pound against my rib cage. Then came the worst one of all. "You don't trust anyone at this company." That hit hard. I had kept my guard up ever since starting this job, and now someone was holding a mirror to my fears. I needed to figure out who was doing this. I decided to go into the storage area where we kept the extra paper and supplies. It was a little less brightly lit, but I felt like I could hide there if necessary. As I stepped inside, I could hear my heart racing, each beat echoing in the silence. In the dark corner of the storage room, I spotted a flickering light. A laptop was sitting on a crate, the screen illuminated. I hesitated for a moment, peering closer. That's when I saw someone sitting in the shadows, hunched over the keyboard. My gut twisted in knots. I thought I might just turn and run, but curiosity held me in place. I needed to know who this person was and how they knew so much about me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure turned, and in that moment, I recognized him. It was Jake, another press operator who had recently started working night shifts. We had exchanged a few words here and there, but nothing significant. He looked up at me, and his expression was hard to read. He didn't speak, but there was a slight smirk on his face that sent chills down my spine. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just working," he replied, his tone casual. "You should see what I've been creating. It's fascinating stuff." He gestured to the laptop, and I saw lines of code, strange symbols forming on the screen. I stepped closer, my heart pounding louder than ever. "Why are you writing about me? How do you know all this stuff?" I felt angry and scared at the same time. I wanted answers, but part of me was terrified of what those answers might be. He leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. It's easy. You leave your life open for anyone to see. I just pick up on the details. There was something sinister in his tone that made my skin crawl. I felt trapped, cornered by his presence. This isn't a joke. It's not funny, I said, trying to sound brave. But fear clawed at my insides. He stood up, his demeanor shifting. You think I'm playing a game? This is serious. You don't even know what I can do with this information. He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away, looking for an escape route. Stop, I said, my voice firm despite the trembling. You're crossing a line. You can't just invade someone's privacy like this. He paused, looking at me with a mix of amusement and irritation. You really should watch your back, he said, stepping closer again. You never know who's watching. I turned and ran out of the storage room, adrenaline flooding my body. I rushed back to my station, desperately trying to shake the feeling of his eyes on me. I needed to get out of there. I wanted to go home and never return. As I reached the main area of the printing shop, I could still hear the hum of the machines, but now it felt suffocating. I grabbed my things, not caring about the printed sheets anymore. I wanted to leave this nightmare behind. I could still feel Jake's presence lingering in the air, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was still watching me, even from a distance. I ran out into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a wave of relief. I drove home in a daze, heart racing, mind racing even faster. I decided I would talk to my boss in the morning. I would tell him everything. I needed to feel safe again. The next day, I went to work and had a conversation with my boss. I explained everything, from the strange symbols to Jake's unsettling behavior. He took my concerns seriously and assured me he would address the situation. They let Jake go that day. I never found out what his intentions were, but I felt a sense of relief as I left the building for the last time. The experience changed how I viewed the world. I learned to be cautious with what I shared, realizing that not everyone can be trusted. I decided to move on, leaving that place behind, but the memory of those printed symbols haunted me for a long time after. I worked at a late-night customer service center. My job involved answering calls from customers who needed help with their accounts. It was mostly uneventful, just me and the glow of the computer screen and the hum of the phones. My shift started at 11 o'clock and ended at 7 in the morning. The hours were quiet, aside from the occasional call from a confused customer. At first, the routine felt comforting. I had my cup of coffee, the sound of typing as I entered data, and the stillness of the night surrounding me. I could always hear the other operators in the background, their voices blending into the soft buzz of the room. But then, things started to change. It began with a call that came in around midnight. The voice on the other end was deep and grating. He asked me a question about his account, but it was the way he spoke that set off alarms in my head. There was something off, something that made my skin crawl. "You sound tired," he said, as if he had been watching me. "Working all night again?" I felt a chill run through me. I had not shared my schedule with anyone outside of work. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a prank. I answered his questions, and when he hung up, I felt relief wash over me. But that relief was short-lived. The calls kept coming. Every time I answered, it was the same voice. He would ask about random things, always knowing when I was alone and when I had my coworkers nearby. "Did you see that new desk they set up in the break room?" he asked one night. "It looks comfortable. You should sit there more often." I felt the blood drain from my face. How could he know these details? At first, I considered the possibility that it might be one of my coworkers playing a prank. I laughed it off, but the laughter died in my throat when he continued to call. "What time does Brenda leave? I heard she might be gone for good." I hung up, my heart racing. I hadn't mentioned anything about Brenda to anyone, let alone to a stranger on the phone. The next week, it escalated. I was alone in the office when the phone rang. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:30 a.m. I picked up. "How are you, Sarah?" he asked. My breath caught in my throat. "Who is this?" I demanded. "Why do you keep calling me?" He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "I just wanted to know if you liked the sandwich from the deli around the corner." I dropped the phone into my lap, heart pounding. How did he know I had gone there on my break? It was the only place open that late. I felt trapped, exposed, as if he had eyes everywhere. The next night, I decided I would not let him scare me. I told my coworkers about the calls, thinking it would help to have someone know. They laughed it off, saying it was just a prank, that I should ignore it. But it was hard to ignore when he called me at the same time every night, each time with a new detail about my life that made me question my safety. "How did you like the new hair color?" he asked one night, catching me completely off guard. I had dyed my hair only a couple of days before. I felt paranoid. I started looking over my shoulder, listening intently to every sound in the office. I stopped taking my breaks outside. I would sit in the break room, staring at my phone, hoping it would not ring. My coworkers noticed I was on edge, and they asked what was wrong, but I did not want to scare them. I thought maybe I was being dramatic. One night, the atmosphere shifted. It was just after 3 a.m., and I was the only one in the office. My heart raced as I answered yet another call from him. "I see you," he said, his voice smooth and low. "You're all alone, aren't you?" I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling. I wanted to scream, to run out of the office, but I was paralyzed by fear. I glanced around the darkened office, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. My eyes darted to the windows, the hallway leading to the exit, and back to my computer screen. The air felt thick, heavy with dread. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I sat frozen, the thought of leaving filling me with terror. Then, the phone rang again. My hands shook as I reached for it. "I'm coming to see you," he said. The line went dead before I could respond. I sprang into action, grabbing my bag and bolting for the exit. I glanced back at the empty office, the phone silent now, my heart racing as I pushed through the door. I rushed to my car, my breath coming in quick gasps. I glanced around the parking lot, my heart pounding. What if he was watching? As I fumbled with my keys, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, ready to scream, but it was just a passing car, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and drove away, not looking back. I called my boss the next day and told him everything. I asked him to check the security footage from the night before. He agreed and told me to stay home until he figured it out. When I returned to work days later, my boss pulled me aside. "We didn't see anyone," he said. "No one came in. It looks like you were alone." I felt a shiver run through me. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "We will keep a closer watch on the cameras. You just need to let us know if it happens again." I tried to breathe, to calm my nerves. But the sense of dread never truly left me. After a week, I resumed my shifts. The calls stopped coming. I didn't know if he had moved on or if he was just waiting for the right moment. Each night I worked, I kept my guard up, my heart racing at the slightest noise. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. The fear faded slowly, replaced by a tentative sense of normalcy. I learned to keep my phone close, to be aware of my surroundings. I never felt completely safe, but I kept working, hoping the worst was over. Then, one night, I heard a familiar voice. It was the same deep, grating tone. "Sarah," it called softly. I froze, feeling ice fill my veins. I glanced at the phone, terror gripping me. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the urge to answer. I decided then that I would not let fear control my life. I picked up the phone. "Who are you?" I demanded, voice steady. But there was silence on the other end, and the call dropped. My hand shook as I set the phone down. I had stood my ground, but the fight was far from over. I would keep my eyes open, keep my heart ready. I would not let him win. I had been working as a campus security guard for a few months. The job felt good. It kept me active and gave me a sense of purpose. My hours were mostly quiet, with just a few students wandering about at night and a few buildings to check on. I would drive around, keeping an eye on things, listening to the radio and enjoying the peace that settled over the campus after dark. It started with a note. One night, after I finished my rounds, I walked back to my car parked near the student center. I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank or a flyer, but when I pulled it out, I felt my heart drop. The note read, "I hope your daughter is doing well in school. She is so bright. I see her every day." I froze. How did someone know I had a daughter? I was careful about sharing personal information, especially with students. I glanced around, expecting to see someone watching me, but the campus was empty, the only sound coming from the distant trees rustling in the wind. I shoved the note into my pocket, uneasy but trying to shake it off. The next night, I found another note on my car. "Your wife must be proud of how hard you work. I can tell you love your family." It was unsettling. I did not understand how this person knew about my family. I started to feel paranoid. I began looking around while I did my rounds, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but I never saw anything. Days passed, and the notes kept coming. Each one revealed more personal details. "Your daughter loves to play soccer. I see her practicing. She is really good. I saw you at the grocery store last week. You should try the apples. They look good." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It was like someone was following me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I told my supervisor about the notes, but he brushed it off. "It is probably just some kid messing around. Don't let it get to you." I wanted to believe that, but it was hard when the notes became more frequent, arriving almost every shift. I started taking different routes when I left my car, making sure to check my surroundings, looking for any sign of someone lurking in the shadows. It became a routine, and each night felt heavier than the last. My sleep was disturbed by anxiety, and I started to dread my shifts. The campus that once felt safe now felt like a trap. One night, while I was making my rounds, I noticed a student lingering near the library. He was dressed in a hoodie, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He kept glancing in my direction, and I felt an uneasy chill run down my spine. I approached him, trying to act casual. "You should head back to your dorm." "It is late," I said, trying to gauge his reaction. He looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was something unsettling in the way he stared at me. He nodded, but his expression did not change. As I turned to walk away, I felt his gaze bore into my back. The hairs on my neck stood up. That night, I found another note waiting for me on the windshield of my car. I saw you talking to that boy. You should be careful. Not everyone is as nice as you. My hand shook as I crumpled the paper. It felt like a threat now, like this person was trying to scare me. I decided enough was enough. I went to the police station nearby and reported everything. I showed them the notes and explained how I felt. They listened, but I could tell they did not take it seriously. They promised to keep an eye on the campus and said they would increase patrols, but it did not ease my mind. After that, I became hypervigilant. I stayed alert, scanning the area wherever I went. I took mental notes of who was around me, which students were near the buildings, and what time they left. Each night, I felt more like a prisoner to my own fears. I would check the parking lot twice before getting into my car, convinced that someone would jump out at me. One evening, as I was leaving for my shift, I spotted the same student from before. He was sitting on a bench near the student union, staring into the distance. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of my next steps. I decided to confront him. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something. Fear? Guilt? He stood up slowly. "I am just sitting. I like to watch the stars," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is that why you keep following me?" I pressed. "I do not follow you," he insisted, but his eyes darted away. The tension in the air was thick. "I know you have been leaving notes on my car." "You need to stop," I said, my voice firm. He blinked, surprised, but then something shifted in his demeanor. A smirk crept onto his face, and he took a step closer. "You should be careful. You never know who is watching you." That was enough for me. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to get away. I turned and walked quickly to my car, not looking back. I was scared, but I knew I had to act. I drove straight to the police station. I needed them to take this seriously. I told them everything: the notes, the student, the confrontation. This time, they listened. An officer agreed to accompany me back to the campus to see if we could find the student. We drove around, and after some time, we spotted him walking on the path near the library. The officer got out and approached him while I stayed in the car, watching. I felt my heart pounding as I waited. I wanted to scream, to shout at the officer to be careful. After a few moments, the officer returned, his expression serious. "We need to talk to you," he said to the student, who seemed to deflate at the confrontation. It turned out that he was indeed the one leaving the notes. The officer searched his belongings and found several crumpled pieces of paper with details about my life, notes that echoed the messages I had received. The student was taken away by the police, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. After that night, I felt a heavy weight lift. The notes stopped, and the campus returned to a sense of normalcy. I still kept my guard up for a while, but the feeling of being watched faded with time. I learned to appreciate the quiet moments again, to enjoy the peace of my shifts without that gnawing sense of dread. Life slowly returned to normal, but I never forgot that feeling of being hunted. The campus, once a safe haven, now held memories of fear. But I also learned to be vigilant, to trust my instincts, and never to dismiss the signs when something felt off. I worked the night shift at a small pharmacy near the edge of town. It was usually quiet, just me, the shelves lined with products, and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. I preferred it that way. There was a certain peace in the stillness of the night, broken only by the occasional customer. One evening, a man walked in. He was tall, with dark hair that looked unkempt. He wore a worn-out jacket and seemed to shuffle rather than walk. I greeted him with the usual smile, but he did not return it. Instead, he moved directly to the over-the-counter medication aisle. I kept an eye on him as he picked up a box of cold medicine. He approached the counter, and I rang him up, taking note of his pale skin and the bags under his eyes. "You must be sick," I said lightly, trying to lighten the mood. He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "No, I just like to keep some on hand." "Every night?" I asked, surprised. He nodded slowly. "It helps me sleep." "Ah," I replied, trying to keep the conversation going. "Good for you." I completed the transaction, and he left without another word. The next night, he returned, same time, same medication. I couldn't help but feel a bit strange about it. "You are back again," I said, raising an eyebrow. "Can't sleep," he replied, his eyes darting around the store as if checking for something. Over the next few weeks, he continued coming in each night. At first, I thought nothing of it. But as we exchanged pleasantries, he began to share more about himself. Little things at first, his job at a warehouse, his favorite television shows, and how he used to love hiking but had stopped after an accident. Each night, he revealed a bit more, always focused on me, as if I was his confidant. One night, I was busy restocking shelves when he walked in. I didn't notice him right away. He cleared his throat, and I turned to face him. "Hey," he said, his voice low and a little shaky. "Hi there," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "Back for more medicine?" He smiled slightly but did not answer. Instead, he leaned closer over the counter, lowering his voice. "I noticed you always wore the same perfume. It's nice." I felt my stomach twist. "Thanks, I guess. It's nothing special." "I like it," he continued, undeterred. "It reminds me of a girl I used to know." I wanted to change the subject. "Do you need anything else tonight?" He hesitated, his gaze boring into me. "Just this," he said, holding up the box of medicine. "But it's not just about the medicine, you know. It's nice to talk to you." That made me uneasy. I handed him the box, forcing a smile. "I'm glad you enjoy it. Have a good night." He lingered for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "I think I'll be coming here more often. You make the nights feel less lonely." I watched him leave, the door chiming softly behind him. I could not shake off the feeling that something was off about him. The next night, he arrived again, his usual routine. I was busy with a customer when he approached the counter. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, he was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Did you miss me?" Not really," I said, trying to sound joking. He chuckled, but it felt hollow. "I missed you. It gets quiet in my life without you here." I forced a laugh, but I felt my heart race. "You should find more things to do then." He took a step closer. "I don't want to do anything else. You are all I need to feel normal." I tried to brush it off as a joke, but his intensity made me uncomfortable. "You are being a bit strange," I said, hoping to lighten the mood. He frowned. "I just want you to understand me." "I think I should go get the manager," I said, backing away slightly. He held up his hands as if in surrender. No, don't do that. I just want to talk." "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. about how you are different from everyone else. You care. That comment sent chills down my spine. I care about my job. I need to do it well. I know you do, he replied, his tone now almost conspiratorial. That's what makes you special. I rang up his purchase, and as he paid, I could not help but notice how his fingers lingered on the counter, brushing against my hand. I pulled away quickly. Thank you, have a good night, I said, forcing the words out. He stepped back, a glint of something dark in his eyes. You don't have to be afraid of me. I just want to be your friend. I have enough friends, I said, my voice firm. He smiled, but it was more of a grimace. You don't know what you're missing. I felt a rush of panic as he left the store, his eyes still fixed on me until the door closed behind him. I knew I had to do something. This was not normal, and I was beginning to feel like he was stalking me. The following night, I told my manager about the man. She listened but seemed unconcerned. He is just a regular customer, she said. If he bothers you, just tell him to leave. That night, I resolved to confront him if he returned. I spent the hours leading up to his arrival pacing behind the counter, heart pounding. When the door finally opened, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. He walked in, looking exactly the same as before. Hey there, beautiful, he said, a smile plastered across his face. Listen, I need to talk to you, I said, my voice more steady than I felt. This is getting weird. You cannot keep coming here every night and acting like this. He tilted his head, confusion crossing his features. What do you mean? I just want to get to know you better. I am just a cashier, I replied firmly. You need to stop making me uncomfortable. He frowned, his expression darkening. You don't understand. I know things about you, things that can make you happy. What do you mean? You are lonely too, he said, taking a step closer. We could help each other. No, I said, shaking my head. You need to leave. I don't want to talk to you anymore. His face twisted in anger. You don't get to decide that. Get out. I shouted, pointing towards the door. For a moment, it seemed like he would lash out, but then he just turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. You will regret this. My heart raced as I watched him go. I called my manager again, asking her to come in. I didn't want to be alone. While I waited, I locked the doors and paced the aisles, feeling trapped. It wasn't long before I saw him outside, watching through the glass. I could feel my breath quickening as I realized he had no intention of leaving. When my manager arrived, I explained everything, showing her the man outside. But by the time we both went to look, he had disappeared. I think he is just playing games, she said, dismissing my fears. You're overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next few nights, I kept a close watch, but he didn't return. I was relieved but also unnerved. Then, one night, as I was closing up, I heard a knock on the glass door. I jumped and turned to see him standing there, his expression eerily calm. No more games, he said softly. I just want to help you. I shook my head, heart racing. Leave me alone. He stepped back, then smiled, but it looked more like a grimace than anything. Fine. I will give you some space. But I will be waiting. I ran to the back, locking the door behind me. I called the police, trembling as I explained everything. They assured me they would send someone to check, but I had learned that I couldn't trust their timeline. I left the store that night, taking a longer route home, looking over my shoulder every few minutes. I stopped at a friend's house and stayed there until dawn. After that night, I never returned to the pharmacy. I found a different job in a busier area, and every time I drove by that store, I felt a shiver down my spine. I did not want to think about what might have happened if I had stayed. Sometimes I still wonder if he ever returned. If he ever found someone else to fixate on. I hoped he didn't. I hoped he stayed far away. But I also knew that no matter where I went, I would always carry that night with me, the feeling of being trapped and watched, and the unsettling realization that sometimes the darkness is found not in shadows, but in the hearts of those who walk among us. I worked the night shift at the docks, a job that was not for everyone. The air was thick with the smell of salt and oil, the sounds of heavy machinery echoing against the rusted metal. I was used to the solitude, just me and the shadows of the containers that towered above. But one night, everything changed. It started with a series of photographs. I had been unloading a shipment when I spotted something white peeking out from under a stack of crates. I knelt down and pulled it out, revealing a faded black and white picture. It showed a group of people at a summer picnic, smiling, carefree. I squinted at the faces, and then I froze. One of them was me, standing there, a child in the foreground, beaming up at the camera. I felt a shiver run down my spine. How did this get here? I checked the date on the back. It was from nearly 2 decades ago, long before I even started working at the docks. I tucked it in my pocket, thinking it must have been a prank. As the night wore on, I found more photographs scattered around the shipping area. One showed my father standing next to a truck, grinning wide. Another showed my first dog, Buddy, chewing on a toy. The last was a picture of me on my first day of school, clinging to my mother's hand. Each photo was a moment from my past, distant yet vivid. The realization began to sink in, creeping like a fog through my mind. Someone knew me. I turned to look around, scanning the dark corners of the dock. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The flickering lights overhead cast strange shadows that seemed to shift with my gaze. I had always felt safe here, but now I was uneasy. As I continued my work, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but each time I turned, there was nothing but darkness. The air felt heavy, and the sounds of the night seemed louder, echoing in my ears. Then I found another photo, this one pinned to a crate. It was different from the others. It showed my house, taken from a distance, the porch light casting a yellow glow over the front yard. My heart raced. How did someone get this? I felt the walls closing in, the shadows creeping closer. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. Is anyone there? Silence. The only response was the wind rustling through the containers. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was lurking in the shadows. Nothing. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't leave without knowing who was behind this. I started walking toward the office, hoping to find something, anything that would explain what was happening. As I stepped into the office, I noticed my reflection in the glass door. The pale face staring back at me looked terrified. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I was a dock worker. I had faced dangers before. I could handle this. I turned to grab my phone to call the police, but stopped when I noticed something on the desk. It was another photograph, placed carefully beside my old radio. This one was different. It showed me standing at the dock with my back turned, the water behind me. I looked at the back, and it simply said, "I am close." A chill ran down my spine. I hurried to the window, peering out into the darkness. The dock was empty, but my gut told me I was not alone. I felt that presence again, lurking just out of sight. In a rush of panic, I decided to search for whoever was watching me. I stepped outside, the night air cold against my skin. I moved toward the shipping containers, shining my flashlight into the gaps. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence. The wind whistled past, but no one responded. I moved deeper into the maze of crates, my heart pounding in my chest. The photos were now crumpled in my hand. I couldn't comprehend why someone would do this. I just wanted to finish my shift and go home. Then I saw a flicker of movement near the far end of the dock. I focused the beam of my flashlight, and there he was. A man, shadowy and hunched over, standing behind a stack of containers. His face was obscured, but I could see his eyes glinting in the darkness, fixed on me. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He straightened, and I felt a surge of fear. He stepped forward into the light, revealing a worn face I recognized. It was someone from my past, a man I had not seen in years. A fleeting memory came rushing back, an old neighbor, someone who had vanished from my life long ago. "I have been watching you," he said, his voice low and raspy. "You have forgotten me. What do you want?" I demanded, stepping back. He smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "I wanted you to remember. You thought you could just forget everyone, but they are always watching. I wanted you to feel it." "What do you mean?" He gestured around the dock. "This place, it holds memories. You can't run from the past." I looked around, the photos suddenly making sense. They were reminders, warnings. "You have been leaving these for me?" "Yes," he replied, stepping closer. "To remind you of who you are. You think you can escape your history, but it follows you." I felt the weight of his words sink in. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I am not afraid of my past. I have moved on." He laughed, a sharp sound that sent a chill through me. "You say that, but look where you are. You are alone in the dark, surrounded by shadows." I took another step back, the urge to flee growing stronger. "Leave me alone. You have no right to do this." He leaned in closer, his expression shifting. "Do you think you can walk away from this? From me?" With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran. I bolted back towards the office, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, footsteps echoing in the stillness. I reached for the door, yanking it open and slamming it shut behind me. I locked it, gasping for breath as I leaned against the wall. My mind raced. I had to get out. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my hand shaking as I explained what was happening. "Stay where you are," the operator said. "Help is on the way." I peered through the blinds, my heart pounding as I scanned the darkness outside. I could see the shadows moving, but there was no sign of him. I waited, nerves fraying with each passing moment. Then I heard the sirens in the distance, growing louder. The sight of flashing lights pierced the night, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The police arrived, and I ran outside, waving my arms frantically. "Over here!" I shouted. They rushed toward me, asking questions. I explained everything, the man, the photos, the memories. They fanned out, searching the area, and within minutes, they found him hiding behind the containers. He did not resist as they apprehended him, his face still twisted in that unnerving smile. "You cannot escape the past," he called out, a hint of madness in his voice. "It will always find you." They took him away, and I felt the tension in my body begin to ease. I stood with the officers as they reassured me that I was safe now. They promised to patrol the area regularly, and I felt a sense of closure wash over me. that night changed everything. I continued working at the docks, but I never forgot what happened. I kept a closer eye on my surroundings, always aware of the shadows that lurked around me. The photos had been a warning, but I had faced it. I learned that sometimes the past does catch up, but it is how you respond that truly matters. I worked the night shift as a nurse at the local hospital, a place that never seemed to sleep. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the hallways. I was used to the quiet hours, filled with the occasional beeping of monitors and the shuffling of feet. But everything changed with one patient. It started with a man named Derek. He was in his late 30s, with a thin frame and deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into you when he spoke. He came in one night with a minor cut on his arm, something that required just a few stitches. I tended to him, and he seemed nervous but grateful. I wrote up the discharge papers, and as he left, he thanked me, his eyes lingering on mine a moment longer than necessary. Days later, he returned. This time he had a small bruise on his forehead. I fell, he said, avoiding my gaze. I checked him over, but everything seemed fine, except for the fact that he kept glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out at him. I discharged him again, wondering if he was just clumsy. By the end of the week, he was back yet again, this time with a cut on his hand. Just a kitchen accident, he said, but I could tell he was lying. Something about his demeanor felt off. I patched him up, my concern growing as I noted the way he watched me. There was a spark of something in his eyes, obsession, perhaps. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was being paranoid. As the nights went on, his visits became more frequent. He would show up with various fake injuries, a scrape here, a bruise there. Each time he returned, he seemed more erratic. One night, he appeared with a bandage wrapped around his leg. I twisted my ankle, he said, but the way he was walking told a different story. It was as if he was forcing himself to look injured just to see me. I started to feel uneasy. He would wait in the small waiting area, watching me as I moved about my duties. His gaze felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I tried to talk to my supervisor about it, but she brushed it off. Some patients just like to come back. You know how it is, she said. But I knew this was different. I could sense something brewing beneath the surface. One night, while I was on my break, I found him sitting in the cafeteria, staring at me with a fixed smile. My stomach twisted. "Are you okay?" I asked, forcing a smile back. "I just wanted to see you," he said. The words sent a chill down my spine. I felt trapped. Each time I saw him, he seemed to cross a line. I decided to document everything. I kept notes on the injuries, the dates, and my feelings. I even started keeping an eye on the entrance, trying to anticipate when he might show up next. But he was unpredictable, like a shadow that refused to leave. One night, I was on my way to the supply room when I heard a noise behind me. I turned, and there he was, Derek, lurking near the nurse's station. His face was pale, eyes wide. "I thought I would find you here," he said, stepping closer. "What do you want, Derek?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need you to help me," he said, his tone shifting from nervous to desperate. "You're the only one who understands." I took a step back, feeling panic rise in my throat. "You need to leave," I said firmly. His expression darkened, and for a moment, I saw a flash of anger. "But I'm not done yet. You don't get to decide when this ends." I turned and rushed down the hall, my heart racing. I didn't look back. I hurried to the nurse's station, my mind racing with thoughts of how to get away from him. I wanted to call security, but I feared it would only escalate things. The rest of my shift was a blur of anxiety. I could feel his eyes on me, like a predator waiting to pounce. I kept my phone close, ready to call for help at a moment's notice. When my shift finally ended, I was relieved but terrified to walk to my car in the dimly lit parking lot. As I approached my vehicle, I noticed something out of place. There, in the front seat, was a small bouquet of flowers, wilting and forgotten. My breath caught in my throat. Who had put them there? I reached for my phone, but before I could dial, I heard a voice behind me. "Do you like them?" I spun around, and there he was again, Derek. He was standing too close, a manic grin plastered across his face. "I wanted to give you something nice. You helped me so much." My heart raced. "Get away from me," I shouted, backing away. His smile faltered, and something darker flickered in his eyes. "I am just trying to show you how much you mean to me. You don't understand what you've done for me." I turned and ran. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed myself harder. I sprinted across the parking lot. My only thought was to get away from him. I could hear him calling after me, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. "Where are you going?" "I just want to help." I reached my car, fumbled with my keys, and finally yanked the door open. I jumped inside and locked it, my hands shaking. I could see him through the windshield, standing there, confused and angry. "Why are you scared?" "I'm just trying to connect with you," he shouted, pounding on the window. I couldn't breathe. I started the engine, heart pounding as I backed out of the space. He moved to the side, still watching me, his expression shifting between anger and hurt. I drove away, my thoughts racing. I couldn't let him know where I lived, but I had to do something. When I got home, I immediately called the police, explaining everything. They took my report seriously and promised to patrol the area. After that night, I didn't see Derek again. The police increased their presence around the hospital, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I continued my shifts, but I was always on edge, looking over my shoulder. Then one night, while I was organizing supplies in the break room, I found a piece of paper taped to the wall. It was a note, and my heart sank as I read it. "I will always be watching you. You cannot escape." I took a deep breath, my heart racing. I called the police again, and they assured me they would take extra measures. They patrolled the hospital every night, and I felt a sense of security return. Derek never showed up again. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the fear subsided. I learned to live with the memories of that night, but the thought of him always lingered in the back of my mind. I was cautious, aware of my surroundings, and made sure to never be alone in dark places. I kept my head up, reminding myself that I had faced my fear and survived. I took extra care of myself and my coworkers, ensuring we all felt safe in our environment. I was a nurse, after all, dedicated to helping others, but now I knew that it was also crucial to protect myself. As the nights continued, I found my footing again. I did my job, cared for my patients, and stayed vigilant. I refused to let fear define me, and for that, I was grateful. I had faced darkness and emerged stronger. I used to work the night shift as a security guard at a mall. It was usually quiet, just me and the soft hum of the cameras monitoring the empty stores and darkened corridors. I liked the solitude, but sometimes it felt a bit eerie being alone in such a big place. One particular night, while I was doing my usual rounds, I noticed something strange on the monitor. A woman was walking through the food court, her movements slow and unsteady. She looked lost, glancing around as if she were trying to find something or someone. I couldn't make out much of her face, but she had long hair and wore a dark jacket that blended in with the shadows. I watched her for a while, thinking it was unusual for anyone to be there at that hour. The mall had been closed for hours. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down to the food court, hoping to help her find her way. As I approached, I called out to her. "Excuse me. Are you all right?" She turned slowly, and my heart dropped when I saw her face. There was a strange look in her eyes, something unsettling. I can't find my way out," she said, her voice almost a whisper. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight on her so I could see better. "It's all right. The exits are just down this way." I gestured toward the main entrance, but she did not move. "You don't understand," she said, taking a step closer to me. "I have been looking for you. I have been following you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Following me? Why would you do that?" "Because we are connected," she said, her expression earnest. "I know you. I know all about you." I took a step back, suddenly feeling vulnerable in her presence. "What do you mean you know me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her eyes brightened, and she smiled. "I know where you live. I know what you like to eat. I know your routine. You are always here at night, just like me." I didn't respond. I could feel the air thickening around us, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get away. "Listen, I think you should leave now," I said, trying to maintain my authority. "You shouldn't be here. The mall is closed." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my words. "You don't get it. We have something special. You feel it too, don't you?" I shook my head, my heart racing. "No. I don't know you. You need to go. I am going to call the police." As soon as I mentioned the police, her demeanor changed. She stepped closer, her voice lowering to a hiss. "You don't want to do that. They won't understand. You and I have a bond. They would only break it." A surge of fear flooded my body. I turned to leave, heading back toward the security desk. I could hear her footsteps following me, quick and determined. I reached for my radio, my fingers trembling as I called in for backup. "Dispatch, I need help. There is a woman in the mall. She is not supposed to be here. She is unwell. Copy that." "Units are on their way," the dispatcher replied, and I felt a small wave of relief wash over me. I turned back toward the woman, who stood at a distance, her eyes locked onto me. "You can't leave," she said softly. "You are mine." Her words chilled me. I took a cautious step back, scanning the area for a way to escape. I could hear the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. "Help is coming," I said, trying to sound confident. "You need to leave now. You cannot stay here." She smiled again, but it did not reach her eyes. "They won't help you. They don't understand." Just then, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the other direction. The woman turned to look, and I seized the opportunity. I sprinted toward the entrance, hoping to reach safety before she realized what I was doing. I could hear her footsteps behind me, fast and relentless. I burst through the double doors, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran to the parking lot, looking for any sign of the police. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a squad car, and relief flooded my veins. I waved my arms, trying to get their attention. "Over here!" I shouted. The officers jumped out of the car and rushed toward me. I turned to look back at the mall entrance, my breath hitching in my throat. The woman was standing just inside, her face expressionless as she watched me. "Are you all right?" one of the officers asked, concern etched on his face. "I don't know who she is, but she has been following me." "I think she is dangerous," I said, my voice shaking. The officers nodded, their expressions serious. They moved toward the entrance, guns drawn, ready to confront her. I stood off to the side, my heart racing as they approached. "Ma'am," one officer called out, "you need to come out. You are not allowed to be here." The woman did not move, just stared at them, and I felt a shiver of fear run down my spine. "Come out now," the officer repeated, his voice firm. Finally, she stepped into the light, and I could see her face clearly again. "I just wanted to be with him," she said, her voice eerily calm. The officers exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing. "We need you to cooperate," one said, taking another step forward. Suddenly, she turned and bolted back into the mall, disappearing into the darkness. The officers pursued her, their flashlights illuminating the path as they shouted for her to stop. I felt a mix of fear and relief. They were trained for this. They would find her, and I was safe now. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. A few moments later, the officers returned, panting but without her. "We lost her," one said, looking frustrated. "She could be anywhere." I felt a pang of panic as they spoke. "What do you mean lost her?" "She could come back." "Not if we have a patrol set up," one officer reassured me. "We will keep the mall secure. If she returns, we will be ready." I nodded, though a part of me remained on edge. I knew she was out there, somewhere. They stayed with me for the remainder of my shift, keeping a close watch on the entrances. I was grateful for their presence, but my mind continued to race. What if she came back? Why had she been following me? As my shift came to an end, I felt a sense of unease linger in the air. I got in my car, looking around before driving away. I made sure to check my mirrors often, half expecting her to appear from the shadows. I left the mall behind, but the feeling of being watched never truly faded. I decided to report everything to my supervisor the next day. I wanted to make sure no one else encountered her, that no one else felt the terror I had felt that night. The following days were tense, but there were no more incidents. I kept to my routines, but I was always aware, always cautious. Each time I heard a sound or saw a shadow, my heart would race, expecting to see her again. Though I did not see her again, I knew I would never forget her face or the way she spoke. I learned that sometimes danger lurked in the most unexpected places. I remained vigilant, always aware of the darkness that could hide just out of sight. It was a routine I had grown accustomed to, the quiet of the office complex as I worked the night shift cleaning after hours. I had taken this job to help pay the bills, and though the pay was not great, it was enough for me to get by. Each night, I would arrive at the building, flip on the lights, and get started on my tasks. The first few nights were uneventful. I pushed my mop across the linoleum floors, vacuumed the carpets, and took out the trash. I usually worked alone, just me and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The office was always empty, which I preferred, but after a few nights, I started to notice something strange. It began with the whispers. I would be in the break room, scrubbing down the countertops, when I thought I heard something like hushed voices just outside the door. Each time, I would freeze and listen, hoping to catch a word or two. But when I opened the door, the hallway was always empty. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, maybe the building settling or the wind outside. But then it happened again. I was cleaning the second floor, pushing my cart of supplies down the long corridor, when I heard it. faint and soft, a whispering sound coming from the end of the hall. I paused, peering into the dim light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. Silence answered me, thick and heavy. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off, blaming the darkness for playing tricks on me. As the nights went by, the whispers became more frequent. Sometimes they sounded closer, like they were right behind me. Other times, it felt as though they were coming from another room entirely. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. One night, as I was finishing up on the first floor, I stumbled across a crumpled piece of paper on the ground near a desk. I picked it up, smoothed it out, and read the scrawled message, "I see you." My heart raced, a cold wave of fear washing over me. Was this a joke? Or was someone actually watching me? I looked around, my breathing quickening. The office was silent, but I felt the weight of the air pressing down on me. I shoved the note into my pocket, finished my cleaning as quickly as I could, and tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. I would just be careful, that was all. But the next night, things escalated. I was vacuuming the third floor, the machine's noise drowning out everything else. I stepped into one of the offices, the sound of the vacuum fading as I focused on the carpet. When I finished, I turned off the machine, but before I could turn to leave, I heard it again, a voice, clear as day. "Why are you here?" I jumped, spinning around. No one was there. The room was empty, just the desk and the chair. My heart pounded in my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted, but there was no answer. I quickly left the room, moving down the hall toward the stairwell. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I reached for my phone, thinking about calling my supervisor or even the police. But just as I was about to dial, I spotted something on the ground, a series of notes, like the first one I found, scattered near the door. I picked one up. "I know you," it read. "I am always watching." I dropped the note as if it burned my fingers, panic rising in my throat. I glanced around, desperate to see if anyone was there. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch in the dim light, and I felt the walls closing in on me. I hurried down the stairs, my heart racing. I reached the lobby and spotted the front door. I thought about leaving, but then I remembered my car was parked far away, and I did not want to risk going outside alone. Instead, I moved behind the front desk and crouched down, hoping that if someone was in the building, they wouldn't find me. Time passed slowly, and I could hear the whispers again, creeping through the silence. I held my breath, straining to hear anything beyond my own pounding heart. It felt like hours before I finally heard footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving through the halls. I peered out from my hiding place. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, and he was carrying a stack of papers. My heart dropped. He looked familiar, but I could not place him. He stopped in the center of the lobby, scanning the area as if he were looking for something. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. My mind raced. Was this the person who had been leaving the notes? Did he work here before? I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to find a way to get out. I waited for a moment until he turned his back to me, and then I quietly slipped out from behind the desk. I crept toward the door, trying to keep my movements slow and quiet. As I reached for the handle, I heard his voice again. "You cannot escape." I froze, terror coursing through my veins. He was watching me, even from behind. I turned to face him, and his eyes locked onto mine. There was something unsettling in his gaze, a twisted sense of familiarity. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "I used to work here. I know everything about this place. I know you." Without thinking, I bolted for the door. I flung it open, the cool night air hitting me like a wave. I ran into the parking lot, my eyes scanning for my car. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quickening. I reached my vehicle and fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking as I tried to unlock the door. I glanced back and saw him approaching, his face twisted with a strange mix of anger and obsession. "You cannot leave," he shouted. I finally got the door open, flinging myself inside. I slammed it shut and locked it, heart racing as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the parking lot, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following. But the road behind me was empty. I had escaped, but the feeling of dread lingered. The next day, I reported everything to the police. I told them about the notes and the man who had been following me. They promised to investigate and reassured me that they would take my safety seriously. I hoped they would find him, but I knew the fear would stay with me for a long time. I quit my job shortly after that. I could not bear the thought of going back to that office complex, of working alone at night again. I found a new job during the day, where I felt safer, more at ease. Though the incident faded into memory, I never forgot the whispers that haunted the empty halls, the man who had watched me from the shadows. It was a reminder that sometimes, the darkness is not just an absence of light, it can hold something much more sinister.